They called it liberation. But by the time freedom reached Dachau, death had already won most of the battle. In the final weeks of the Second World War, as Nazi Germany collapsed and Allied forces closed in from every direction, Dachau did not slow down. It did not empty. It did not stop killing. Instead, it became a place where the machinery of terror broke down into something even more dangerous: chaos, neglect, and mass death by abandonment. Trains arrived not with prisoners, but with corpses. Barracks overflowed beyond human capacity. Disease spread faster than fear. And the camp, built as the first model of Nazi repression, revealed its true final function. Not incarceration, but disposal. This was not extermination by gas chambers. It was extermination by starvation, disease, exhaustion, exposure, and deliberate overcrowding. A slow-motion annihilation carried out in plain sight as the world approached victory. When American soldiers finally reached Dachau in April 1945, they did not step into a battlefield. They stepped into silence, rot, and disbelief. Skeletal survivors stared through barbed wire. Bodies lay stacked in open courtyards. And on the railway siding stood a sealed train, boxcars packed with thousands of dead men. A death train that would become one of the most haunting images of the Holocaust. What followed was not just liberation, but shock, rage, emergency medicine, war crimes documentation, and a reckoning that would echo through history. So how bad were the final months inside Dachau Concentration Camp? This documentary begins at the end with the death train and traces backward through collapse, evacuation, death marches, disease, and survival to understand how Dachau became the blueprint for Nazi terror, and how its final days exposed the full truth of a system built on cruelty, obedience, and dehumanization. This is not a story meant to shock. It is a story meant to be remembered. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters, and together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1, Dachau Before the End. Dachau did not begin as a death camp, and that is precisely why its final months matter so much, because Dachau was the prototype, the original blueprint from which the entire Nazi camp system grew, a place created not initially to kill, but to break, to intimidate, and to demonstrate what would happen to those who stood outside the boundaries of the new German state. And by the time the war entered its final year, everything Dachau had been designed to test, refine, and normalize had reached its most lethal form. Established in March 1933, just weeks after Adolf Hitler became chancellor, Dachau was presented to the German public as a protective custody camp. A place where political enemies, communists, social democrats, trade unionists, journalists, would be detained for the safety of the nation. But from its earliest days, the camp functioned as a laboratory of terror, where the SS experimented with methods of control, punishment, forced labor, humiliation, and psychological destruction, practices that would later be exported across the Reich and into occupied Europe. And over the years, Dachau expanded again and again, absorbing new prisoner categories as Nazi persecution widened, including Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, homosexual men, so-called asocials, clergy, and eventually tens of thousands of Jews, turning the camp into a sprawling complex of barracks, workshops, sub-camps, and industrial labor sites that fed directly into the German war economy. By the time World War II began, Dachau was already deeply embedded in the SS system, staffed by men trained not only to guard but to dominate absolutely, men who rotated through Dachau as part of their professional formation, learning how to rule through fear, how to extract labor through violence, and how to view prisoners not as people but as expendable material. And as the war progressed, the camp's purpose shifted again, becoming a central hub for forced labor tied to armaments production, construction, projects, and military infrastructure throughout southern Germany, which led to the creation of more than 140 satellite camps, each one replicating Dachau's methods on a smaller scale. Yet even as Dachau's labor output increased, conditions inside the main camp steadily deteriorated, because the system was not built to sustain life, only to consume it, and as food shortages intensified across Germany, prisoner rations were cut to starvation levels. Medical care collapsed into cruelty, discipline became more arbitrary, and death became routine, recorded bureaucratically as heart failure, pneumonia, or exhaustion, even when the true cause was beatings, malnutrition, or deliberate neglect. By 1944, Dachau was no longer simply a prison or labor camp. It was an overcrowded holding pen for human beings the regime no longer knew how or cared to manage, as transports arrived from across Europe carrying prisoners evacuated from camps closer to the front lines, swelling the population far beyond capacity, with barracks designed for a few hundred now holding over 2,000 men packed together on wooden bunks or bare floors, breathing the same foul air, sharing the same contaminated water, and living among lice, filth, and disease. The SS responded not with relief but with tightening control, reducing food further, increasing punishments, and allowing typhus to spread unchecked because illness itself had become a weapon, an efficient way to thin the population without bullets or gas, and it was in this environment, already collapsing, already lethal, that the final months of Dachau unfolded, not as a sudden descent into horror, but as the logical conclusion of a system that had always prioritized obedience over humanity, efficiency over life, and ideology over consequence, a system that did not require explicit extermination orders to kill, because death was built into every layer of its operation. As Allied armies pushed closer in late 1944 and early 1945, Dachau did not empty, it filled, becoming a dumping ground for the remnants of the Nazi camp universe. And in doing so, it exposed the true function of the concentration camp system at the moment of its collapse, revealing that even without gas chambers, even without organized mass executions, a camp like Dachau could still destroy tens of thousands of people through deliberate abandonment, calculated neglect, and the slow violence of starvation and disease, setting the stage for the final catastrophe that awaited both prisoners and liberators alike. Chapter 1, Segment 2: Overcrowding, Hunger, and the Collapse of Survival. By late 1944, Dachau had crossed a threshold beyond which survival itself became accidental rather than possible, because the camp was no longer operating within even the brutal logic it had maintained for years, but had become a human reservoir into which the collapsing Reich poured its unwanted, its witnesses, and its expendable bodies, and this transformation was driven first and foremost by overcrowding on a scale that defied any remaining structure. Transports began arriving almost daily. From camps evacuated in the east as Soviet forces advanced, from places like Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, and Natzweiler, bringing prisoners already weakened by months or years of starvation, disease, and abuse, and these men were crammed into Dachau without additional barracks, food, or sanitation, turning the camp into a sealed environment where death circulated faster than information. Barracks originally designed to house 200 prisoners now held well over 1,000, with triple-tiered bunks overflowing until men slept on concrete floors, in aisles, beneath bunks, pressed together so tightly that movement at night became impossible, and with each new arrival, the air thickened with the smell of unwashed bodies, waste, and sickness, while latrines overflowed and water supplies failed, forcing prisoners to drink from contaminated sources that spread dysentery and typhus with terrifying speed. Food, already insufficient, collapsed into ritual starvation as daily rations shrank to a piece of bread so small it could disappear in the palm of a hand, a watery soup often made from turnips or rotting vegetables, and nothing more, leaving prisoners trapped in a constant state of hunger so extreme that men fought over scraps, searched garbage pits, and chewed on grass or sawdust simply to quiet the pain in their stomachs. And in this state, the body turned against itself, muscles wasting away, organs weakening, wounds refusing to heal, until even standing for roll call became an act of endurance. Medical care, never intended to heal, now barely existed at all, as the camp infirmary overflowed with skeletal figures lying three to a bunk, untreated and contagious, while SS doctors and prisoner functionaries made selections not to save lives, but to decide who was already too weak to justify food, labor, or space, condemning them to die quietly in corners or be sent away on transports that rarely returned. Typhus, the disease that would define Dachau's final months, spread rapidly through lice-infested clothing and blankets, and once it took hold, it tore through the camp with ruthless efficiency, causing fever, delirium, and death within days, while the SS responded not with quarantine or aid, but with indifference, sealing barracks, abandoning the sick, and allowing thousands to perish because containment mattered more than life. As mortality soared into the thousands each month, the crematoria could no longer keep pace, and bodies accumulated in courtyards, behind barracks, and near the infirmary, stacked like cordwood or left where they fell, transforming Dachau into a landscape of visible death that stripped away any remaining illusion of order. Yet even then, the system continued to function mechanically, roll calls still held, punishments still enforced, work details still assigned, as if the appearance of control could delay collapse. The SS guards, increasingly demoralized and fearful of the approaching Allies, grew more violent and unpredictable, beating prisoners for minor infractions, shooting those who collapsed during labor, and retreating emotionally into cruelty as authority slipped from their grasp, while prisoners, sensing both the proximity of liberation and the nearness of death, existed in a fragile space between hope and resignation, clinging to rumors, counting distant artillery, and watching the sky for Allied planes, all while knowing that liberation might arrive too late for their own bodies to endure. Dachau in these months was not defined by spectacular acts of violence, but by the grinding, omnipresent certainty that the camp was killing simply by continuing to exist, and that every hour spent inside its fences increased the likelihood of becoming another anonymous corpse in a place that no longer pretended to preserve life, only to manage its disappearance. Chapter 1, Segment 3. Death becomes routine. By the final winter of Dachau's existence, death was no longer an event marked by alarm or reaction, but a constant background condition woven into every hour of camp life, so normalized that prisoners stepped over corpses on the way to roll call and guards no longer bothered to acknowledge the dead unless their presence interfered with routine. Each morning began with the discovery of bodies stiffened by cold, men who had gone to sleep or collapsed, only to never wake again, their faces frozen, in expressions of exhaustion rather than fear, because fear required energy that starvation had long since taken away, and these bodies were dragged outside by fellow prisoners assigned to corpse details, stacked near barracks walls or along paths, sometimes left for days before removal because the camp's infrastructure had completely failed to keep pace with the dying. Roll calls stretched for hours as the SS demanded exact counts despite the chaos, forcing living prisoners to stand motionless beside the dead, sometimes holding up corpses to maintain formation, while guards screamed numbers into ledgers that still pretended Dachau was functioning as an orderly institution rather than a collapsing death zone. The psychological impact of this environment was devastating, as men learned to detach emotionally from the suffering around them simply to survive, suppressing grief, ignoring screams from the infirmary, and avoiding eye contact with the dying, because acknowledging each death meant confronting the possibility of one's own imminent end. And yet, even in this numbness, moments of humanity persisted in fragile forms. Prisoners sharing crumbs of bread with those weaker than themselves, whispering prayers over dying friends, or quietly covering faces with scraps of cloth to preserve a shred of dignity in a place designed to erase it. The SS, meanwhile, oscillated between apathy and cruelty, some guards retreating into silence and avoidance as the Reich's defeat became inevitable, others lashing out violently, enforcing discipline with renewed brutality as if terror itself could restore control, beating prisoners for collapsing, shooting those deemed too slow, and abandoning entire barracks of sick men to die without water or care, while camp administrators focused increasingly on paperwork and evacuation orders rather than survival, prioritizing the removal of evidence over the preservation of life. Rumors spread rapidly through the camp, stories of Allied advances, of camps liberated in the west, of German retreat. But hope was tempered by the knowledge that time itself was the enemy, because bodies weakened by months of starvation could not simply be rescued back to health, and many prisoners understood that even if liberation came tomorrow, it might come too late for them. As death rates soared, mass graves were dug hastily in nearby areas, crematoria worked until breakdown, and when fuel or capacity failed, bodies were left exposed, further spreading disease and reinforcing the sense that Dachau had crossed into a final, irreversible phase, one in which the camp no longer needed explicit orders to kill because neglect itself had become lethal. And yet, in this final descent, the system continued to demand obedience, to extract labor where possible, to enforce hierarchy among prisoners through capos, maintaining the structure of oppression even as its purpose disintegrated, proving that the horror of Dachau was not only in the suffering it caused, but in how efficiently it trained both victims and perpetrators to accept death as routine, as paperwork, as background noise, setting the stage for the moment when the gates would finally open and the world would be forced to confront what had been allowed to exist for far too long. Chapter 2, Segment 1, Evacuation Orders and the Logic of Erasure. As the front lines collapsed and Allied armies pushed deeper into Germany, Dachau entered a new phase of terror defined not by confinement, but by movement. An order from Berlin and SS headquarters that camps were not to fall intact into enemy hands, that prisoners were to be evacuated eastward or southward, away from approaching forces, and that no living witnesses were to remain behind to testify to what had been done. This policy of evacuation was presented in bureaucratic language, typed onto orders and transmitted through command channels as a logistical necessity, but in practice it became a campaign of mass murder by exhaustion, exposure, and execution, because the SS knew full well that tens of thousands of prisoners were physically incapable of travel, let alone forced marches over long distances with no food, shelter, or medical care. Beginning in early April 1945, transport columns were assembled hastily from Dachau and its vast network of subcamps. Prisoners herded together regardless of condition, many barely able to stand, some delirious with fever, others skeletal from starvation, and pushed onto roads under armed guard, while those deemed too weak to move were often shot on the spot or left behind to die, their fate sealed by abandonment. The logic behind these evacuations was not survival, but concealment, an attempt to dissolve evidence into chaos, to scatter bodies across forests, villages, and roadsides where no single place could fully testify to the scale of the crime, and this logic was reinforced by fear within the SS ranks themselves, as guards understood that capture could mean accountability, and that prisoners who reached Allied lines alive would become witnesses. Trains were assembled when tracks were available, boxcars crammed beyond capacity, sealed for days without water or sanitation, turning transport into mobile mass graves, while on foot, death marches stretched across Bavaria, leaving behind trails of corpses that local civilians could not ignore, despite years of propaganda urging them to look away. Prisoners collapsed from hunger and frostbite, were beaten to their feet if possible, and shot if not, the sound of gunfire punctuating long columns of shuffling men whose identities had been reduced to numbers long ago. For the prisoners, evacuation was a cruel paradox, because movement suggested change and perhaps freedom, yet in reality it multiplied danger, severing any remaining access to shelter or meager camp rations, exposing them to weather, violence, and arbitrary execution, and many understood quickly that survival now depended less on endurance than on chance. Whether a guard hesitated, whether a farmer offered water in secret, whether a column was overtaken by Allied troops before it disintegrated entirely. Chaos reigned within SS command structures as well, with conflicting orders, collapsing communications, and commanders improvising evacuations without supplies or destinations, leading to columns that wandered aimlessly for days, doubling back, splitting apart, or abandoning prisoners en masse, while others continued marching long after the war was effectively lost, driven by indoctrination, fear, or habit rather than strategic necessity. In this phase, Dachau ceased to be a single place and became a moving catastrophe, its violence exported across the countryside, implicating roads, villages, and fields in the final act of the camp system, ensuring that even as physical structures were emptied or destroyed, the human cost multiplied rather than diminished. And yet, within this chaos, cracks appeared in the machinery of terror. Guards deserting their posts, civilians offering aid at great personal risk, prisoners slipping away during confusion. Small moments that hinted at the system's collapse, even as it continued to kill, setting the stage for liberation that would arrive not as a clean ending, but as an interruption of an atrocity already spiraling beyond control. Chapter 2, Segment 2. The Death Marches from Dachau. As evacuation orders spread through Dachau and its satellite camps, the abstract language of transport and relocation translated on the ground into what survivors would later name the Death Marches. Forced journeys carried out at the very moment the Nazi system was collapsing. When resources were gone, discipline was fraying, and cruelty had become reflex rather than policy, yet still lethal in its consequences. Prisoners were driven out in columns that stretched for kilometers, guarded by sus men who were themselves exhausted, fearful, and increasingly brutal, and the marches moved through towns and countryside alike, exposing the reality of the camps to a civilian population that had long been encouraged to believe rumors rather than truths. While for the prisoners the road offered no shelter, no rest, and almost no food, only the relentless demand to keep moving despite bodies reduced by starvation, disease, and injury. Those who stumbled were beaten, those who collapsed were often shot, and the pace was dictated not by human capacity but by the guards' anxiety to stay ahead of Allied advances, creating a rhythm of violence that was arbitrary and terrifying, because survival could hinge on a single moment, whether a guard looked away, whether a fellow prisoner supported another's weight, whether nightfall slowed the column enough to allow someone to slip into a ditch or forest. The marches were not uniform experiences but shared a common logic of disposability, with prisoners treated as burdens rather than people, their lives valued only insofar as they could still move, and when movement stopped, so did mercy. Along the routes, mass graves appeared hastily dug near roadsides, fields, and woods, sometimes marked by local villagers after the war, sometimes left unmarked for decades, evidence of how the final violence of the camp system spilled outward into the landscape, ensuring that Dachau's crimes were no longer confined behind barbed wire. Hunger defined every step, as prisoners scavenged for grass, bark, or scraps thrown secretly by civilians who risked severe punishment, while thirst became acute as guards denied access to wells and streams, forcing men to drink from puddles or melted snow, worsening illness and exhaustion. Disease traveled with the columns, especially typhus and dysentery, spreading rapidly among tightly packed groups with no sanitation, and the sick were the first to fall behind, marking them as targets for execution or abandonment. Yet even in this environment, instances of solidarity persisted, with prisoners sharing crumbs, supporting the weakest, and whispering encouragement in many languages. A quiet resistance that did not stop death but affirmed humanity in the face of deliberate degradation. The guards' behavior varied widely, revealing the unraveling of authority. Some clung fanatically to orders, others drank heavily, argued among themselves, or deserted altogether, leaving columns leaderless and confused, while rumors spread among prisoners that liberation was near, that American or Allied forces were only days away, creating a fragile hope that coexisted with overwhelming despair. The marches thus became a final test imposed by a dying regime, a last attempt to maintain control through movement and fear, even as its ideological foundations collapsed. And when Allied units finally encountered these columns, emaciated figures staggering along roads under armed guard, the Visual shock exposed the reality of the camps more vividly than any document could, transforming abstract knowledge into undeniable fact. In this way, the death marches from Dachau were not only an extension of camp brutality but also the moment when the system's violence became impossible to hide, when its logic of annihilation marched directly into public view, ensuring that even as the SS sought to erase evidence, they instead scattered it across the very ground of Germany, leaving behind a trail of suffering that would define the memory of Dachau's final weeks long after the marching stopped. Chapter 2, Segment 3, Collapse Without Rescue. As the death marches drained Dachau of tens of thousands of prisoners, those left behind inside the camp entered a final phase of collapse that was no less lethal than the roads outside the wire, because evacuation did not bring relief so much as abandonment, transforming Dachau into a place where systems failed faster than bodies could endure, where authority fractured and survival became a matter of chance measured in hours rather than days. Barracks already overcrowded beyond endurance now, filled with the sickest, the weakest, and those unable to march. Men riddled with typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, and starvation edema, lying packed together on bare planks or floors slick with filth, with no medicine, no sanitation, and almost no food, as SS administration unraveled and guards either fled, hid, or maintained a hollow presence without meaningful control. Food deliveries ceased or arrived sporadically, water systems failed repeatedly, electricity flickered and died, and the camp's internal order collapsed into a grim stillness broken only by coughing, moaning, and the sound of bodies being dragged away, while crematoria that had once symbolized bureaucratic efficiency now stood overwhelmed, incapable of keeping pace with daily death rates that reached into the thousands, forcing corpses to be stacked in courtyards, along baroque walls, and beside latrines, where they lay exposed for days, bloating and decaying in the open air. Fear and confusion spread among prisoners, who knew liberation was close but could not know whether they would survive long enough to see it, as rumors circulated wildly. Some claiming the SS plan to kill those remaining, others insisting the Americans were only hours away, creating a psychological torment in which hope itself became dangerous, because each false dawn crushed spirits already near breaking. Meanwhile, the SS leadership at Dachau received contradictory orders from a collapsing command structure, oscillating between evacuation, concealment, and abandonment, resulting in chaotic decision-making that left prisoners in limbo, neither protected nor systematically exterminated, but instead subjected to what historians would later recognize as extermination through neglect, where death was no longer organized efficiently yet remained inevitable for many. Within this chaos, some guards continued acts of cruelty out of habit or hatred, beating prisoners, withholding water, or shooting individuals without provocation, while others avoided contact entirely, locking themselves in offices or fleeing into the countryside, shedding uniforms or attempting to blend into civilian populations as the reality of defeat became unavoidable. Prisoner self-organization emerged in fragments, with clandestine committees attempting to distribute scraps of food, isolate the sick as best they could, and prepare for the arrival of Allied forces, knowing that a misstep, an uprising too early, a visible challenge to remaining guards, could still provoke massacre, making restraint itself a form of resistance. Disease reached its peak in these final days, especially typhus, which spread unchecked through lice-infested clothing and overcrowded rooms, killing indiscriminately and threatening to turn liberation itself into a medical catastrophe, as even those who survived starvation now faced death from infection, dehydration, or shock. Time lost meaning as days blurred together in a fog of exhaustion and fear, with prisoners measuring survival not by calendars but by roll calls that no longer happened, by the absence of gunfire at night, by distant sounds of artillery that seemed impossibly close and impossibly far at once. When SS guards finally began to disappear in larger numbers, abandoning posts entirely, Dachau entered a strange interim state. No longer fully under Nazi control but not yet free, where prisoners waited in a silence broken only by death itself, unsure whether the absence of guards signaled liberation or a trap, because experience had taught them that hope often preceded catastrophe. This liminal moment, suspended between terror and freedom, defined the camp's final hours, as Dachau ceased to function as an institution yet continued to kill simply by the conditions it had created, leaving behind a landscape of human devastation that would confront liberators not as a battlefield, but as the aftermath of a system that had consumed itself while destroying nearly everyone trapped within it. Chapter 3, Segment 1: The Death Train and the First Shock of Liberation. In the early hours of April 29, 1945, the approach to Dachau did not announce itself with gunfire or resistance, but with a smell so overwhelming that even hardened American soldiers slowed their advance. A sickening stench of rot and human decay drifting across the Bavarian countryside long before the camp itself came into view, signaling that something unprecedented lay ahead. Just outside the camp perimeter, U.S. forces encountered a line of freight cars sitting motionless on the tracks. An unguarded train that at first appeared abandoned, until soldiers forced open the sealed doors and were met with a scene that would define Dachau in the global memory of the Holocaust. The boxcars were packed wall to wall with corpses, thousands of bodies piled atop one another in grotesque stillness, men who had suffocated, starved, or died of disease during transport from Buchenwald, their faces frozen in contorted expressions, their clothing stiff with excrement, blood, and decay, creating what would later be known as the Death Train, a mobile mass grave delivered intact to the edge of liberation. This was not a battlefield casualty or the aftermath of combat, but the visible endpoint of systematic cruelty, and for the American troops, many of whom had fought across France and Germany, nothing in their training had prepared them for the realization that these men had been murdered without weapons, without explosions, without urgency, simply by being locked inside rail cars and forgotten. Word spread quickly through the advancing units, and fury mingled with disbelief as soldiers moved forward toward the camp gates, already emotionally shattered before they had encountered a single living prisoner. When Dachau itself came into view, the camp presented a deceptive stillness, barbed wire glinting in the spring light, guard towers standing silent, and SS personnel scattered or surrendering without resistance, as if the machinery of terror had simply shut down moments before exposure, leaving behind its products but not its operators. Inside the gates, the scale of devastation expanded beyond comprehension, as skeletal prisoners in striped uniforms emerged hesitantly from barracks, many too weak to stand, others staring blankly with eyes that no longer seemed capable of processing reality, while corpses lay strewn across courtyards, stacked near buildings, and piled beside the crematorium. Evidence that death had continued until the very last days, unconcerned with the proximity of Allied forces. American medics and officers struggled to impose order on a situation that defied every conventional framework of war, because Dachau was not a prison to be secured or a city to be liberated, but a humanitarian disaster unfolding in real time, where thousands hovered between life and death, and any misstep, food given too quickly, movement encouraged too soon, could kill those they were trying to save. The shock experienced by the liberators was not fleeting but transformative, as seasoned soldiers broke down, vomited, wept, or stood in stunned silence, confronted with the realization that the war they thought they understood had concealed a dimension of cruelty beyond combat, one that had been hidden behind bureaucracy, euphemism, and barbed wire. Reports were filed immediately, photographs taken obsessively, and survivors urged, where possible, to speak, because even in those first moments there was an instinctive understanding that what lay before them would be denied, minimized, or forgotten unless captured in undeniable detail. Dachau's liberation was therefore not a moment of triumph but of reckoning, where victory felt hollow in the presence of irreversible loss, and where the reality of Nazi terror could no longer be abstracted into ideology or statistics, because it stood embodied in every corpse, every survivor's hollow gaze, and every American soldier who realized that the end of the war did not mean the end of its consequences. Chapter 3, Segment 2, Collapse from Within, Disease, Starvation, and the Machinery Breaking Down. By the final months of the war, Dachau was no longer a functioning concentration camp in the sense the SS had designed it. It was a system collapsing inward, devouring itself through overcrowding, starvation, and disease, long before American troops reached its gates, as transports from evacuated camps in the east poured relentlessly into a complex already stretched beyond endurance, swelling the prisoner population to more than double what the barracks, sanitation systems, and food supplies could possibly sustain. Men arrived after weeks of forced marches or sealed rail transports, already skeletal, frostbitten, and diseased, collapsing onto camp grounds where there was no space, no medicine, and no plan for survival, only the unspoken assumption that most would die quickly and quietly. Typhus spread like wildfire, carried by lice thriving in unwashed bodies and rotting uniforms, turning entire barracks into feverish mass graves where prisoners lay delirious, shivering, and hallucinating as temperatures dropped and rations shrank to thin, watery soup that offered calories without nourishment, enough to prolong suffering but not enough to restore strength. The camp's infrastructure, once meticulously organized to enforce discipline and labor, simply failed, with water systems breaking down, sewage backing up, electricity faltering, and medical facilities reduced to places where prisoners went not to heal but to be counted among the dying. SS doctors and guards, themselves increasingly aware that the Reich was collapsing, withdrew from responsibility, abandoning wards, falsifying records, or fleeing altogether, leaving capos and prisoner functionaries to manage impossible conditions with no resources and no authority. Forced to decide who might receive a scrap of bread or a place near a stove and who would be left on the floor to die. The crematoria, designed for steady but controlled killing, could no longer keep pace with the sheer volume of death, resulting in bodies accumulating in open areas, stacked behind barracks, or left where they fell, further accelerating the spread of disease and deepening the psychological trauma of those still alive, who lived surrounded by the unburied dead. This phase of Dachau was not marked by dramatic executions or mass shootings but by a quieter, more insidious extermination, one driven by deliberate neglect, by policies that ensured overcrowding without provision, and by an SS command structure that understood starvation and disease as acceptable, even desirable, outcomes in the war's final chapter. Prisoners later recalled that hope itself became dangerous during these weeks, because believing survival was possible only made the daily losses more unbearable, as men watched friends die overnight, vanish during roll call, or simply fail to wake up in the morning, their bodies stiff beside them on wooden planks. Yet, even amid this systemic breakdown, traces of humanity persisted in whispered warnings about disease, in the sharing of crumbs, in attempts to wash with melted snow, and in the quiet determination of some prisoners to stay alive not because they expected freedom, but because survival itself had become an act of defiance against a system that now killed indiscriminately through chaos rather than command. Dachau in these final months was thus neither fully controlled nor entirely abandoned, but suspended in a lethal limbo where the Nazi machinery of terror continued to function through inertia alone, grinding lives down even as the ideology that created it disintegrated, leaving behind a landscape of suffering so extreme that liberation, when it came, would feel less like rescue and more like arriving too late at the scene of an ongoing catastrophe. Chapter 3, Segment 3, Evacuation Orders and the Death Marches, Killing While Retreating. As the Allied armies closed in during the spring of 1945, the SS leadership overseeing Dachau received orders that revealed the final logic of the Nazi camp system. Prisoners were not to be liberated under any circumstances, and if the camps could no longer be held, the inmates themselves were to be removed, dispersed, or destroyed, not for military necessity, but to erase witnesses and maintain ideological control even in defeat. Thus began the evacuation phase, a euphemism that masked what survivors would later call death marches, forced movements of tens of thousands of prisoners through Bavaria and southern Germany under conditions designed to ensure that many would not survive. as guards drove columns of emaciated men out of Dachau and its subcamps with little food, no medical care, and orders to shoot anyone who fell behind, collapsed, or attempted to escape. These marches were chaotic and brutal, unfolding across muddy roads, bombed villages, and frozen countryside, with prisoners already weakened by starvation and disease now pushed to walk dozens of kilometers a day, often barefoot or wrapped in rags, sleeping outdoors or crammed into barns, while typhus and dysentery spread unchecked and bodies accumulated along roadsides, in ditches, and behind farmhouses where local civilians, powerless or terrified, watched the columns pass. The SS guards themselves were exhausted, frightened, and increasingly violent, oscillating between panic and cruelty, sometimes abandoning prisoners mid-march, sometimes massacring entire groups when discipline broke down, leaving mass graves hastily covered with earth or not covered at all. Alongside these marches ran the railway evacuations, where prisoners were packed into sealed freight cars, dozens per wagon without water or sanitation, for journeys that lasted days or weeks, many dying en route from dehydration, suffocation, or untreated illness, transforming the trains into rolling tombs that moved endlessly through a collapsing Reich. The most infamous of these transports, later known as the Death Train, would become one of the first horrors encountered by American forces near Dachau, but it was only one example among many, part of a larger pattern in which evacuation was not an attempt to save prisoners, but a continuation of extermination by other means. Survivors recalled that the marches stripped away any remaining illusion that the camp system might end with surrender or negotiation, replacing it with the understanding that the SS intended to kill as many prisoners as possible before the war ended, not through organized mass murder, but through exposure, exhaustion, and execution on the road. Yet even in this final descent into chaos, acts of resistance and solidarity emerged, as prisoners supported one another while walking, shared scraps of food, whispered warnings about guards who were quick to shoot, and sometimes hid the weakest among them when columns passed through forests or villages, knowing that survival depended not only on strength, but on collective will. For many, liberation would come not at Dachau itself, but along these roads, when advancing Allied units stumbled upon abandoned columns, scattered corpses, and stunned survivors who could barely comprehend that the guards had fled and the killing had finally stopped. The death marches thus represent the last operational phase of Dachau's terror, not a deviation from Nazi policy, but its logical endpoint, demonstrating that even in retreat, even in collapse, the system continued to prioritize destruction over surrender, erasure over accountability, and death over the acknowledgement of defeat, ensuring that the final weeks of the camp would be among its deadliest, and that the road to liberation would be paved with bodies left behind by an ideology unwilling to stop killing, even as it fell apart. Chapter 4, Segment 1, Liberation Approaches, the Camp in its Final Days. By April 1945, Dachau existed in a state that can only be described as terminal collapse, a place still functioning on paper as a concentration camp, but in reality reduced to a vast, overcrowded zone of unmanaged death, where the Nazi system no longer maintained control yet continued to kill through neglect, disease, and fear. The front lines were now unmistakably close, artillery thunder echoed in the distance, Allied aircraft roared overhead daily, and rumors spread among prisoners faster than the SS could suppress them. Rumors of American troops advancing through Bavaria, rumors that the war was ending, rumors that liberation was imminent, each one colliding violently with the reality inside the camp, where starvation deepened, typhus spread unchecked, and bodies continued to pile up faster than they could be removed. The SS command at Dachau was fractured and confused, caught between contradictory orders from Berlin, collapsing communications, and their own desperation to avoid capture, leading to a final period marked not by organized extermination, but by abandonment, improvisation, and frantic attempts to erase evidence of crimes that had already grown far beyond concealment. Crematoria operated sporadically due to fuel shortages and mechanical failure, leaving corpses stacked in open courtyards, along barracks walls, and inside huts where the living slept beside the dead. While the camp's sewage system failed entirely, contaminating water sources and accelerating the spread of disease. Guards deserted their posts in growing numbers, some fleeing outright, others blending into civilian clothing, while remaining SS personnel alternated between moments of panic-driven brutality and complete disengagement, no longer enforcing regulations consistently, yet still willing to shoot prisoners at random or in retaliation for perceived disobedience. Inside the barracks, prisoners sensed the shift, understanding that the system holding them was breaking apart, but also fearing that this breakdown might result in a final massacre before liberation, a fear reinforced by the recent evacuations and death marches that had removed tens of thousands and demonstrated the SS willingness to kill rather than surrender prisoners alive. Food distributions became increasingly erratic, with some days bringing nothing at all, others offering thin soup made from rotting vegetables, while prisoners scavenged for anything remotely edible: grass, peels, scraps, despite the risk of fatal illness from contaminated sources. Typhus reached epidemic levels, carried by lice that thrived in the overcrowded, unwashed environment, turning entire barracks into quarantine zones where death came quietly at night and bodies were discovered only in the morning, sometimes dozens at a time. Medical care had collapsed entirely as prisoner doctors lacked medicine, bandages, and even basic sanitation, forced to decide who might still be saved and who was beyond help, a burden that haunted survivors long after the war. Meanwhile, the SS attempted to destroy records, burn documents, and dismantle parts of the camp infrastructure. But the scale of Dachau made full erasure impossible, and evidence of mass death lay everywhere. In the crematoria, the mass graves, the skeletal bodies of prisoners barely able to stand. Outside the barbed wire, German civilians in nearby towns sensed the approaching end. Hearing the guns, seeing the refugees, watching columns of prisoners pass on. Death marches, and some began to grasp, perhaps for the first time, the magnitude of what had existed in their midst. Inside the camp, hope and terror coexisted in equal measure, as prisoners whispered about liberation while watching guards load weapons and prepare defenses, uncertain whether the final act would be rescue or slaughter. This was the atmosphere in which Dachau awaited the arrival of American forces, not as a functioning institution, but as a collapsing crime scene still actively producing death, where the Nazi system had lost its ability to manage genocide efficiently yet had not lost its capacity to destroy human life, ensuring that even in its final days, Dachau remained true to its purpose as the blueprint of terror, a place where suffering did not end with the approach of freedom, but continued until the very moment the gates were forced open. Chapter 4, Segment 2. The Death Marches, Evacuation as Extermination. As Allied forces closed in from multiple directions, the SS leadership overseeing Dachau received orders that revealed the final logic of the Nazi camp system. Prisoners were not to be liberated. They were to be removed, regardless of whether removal meant survival or death, and so began the last great phase of killing tied to Dachau, not through gas or formal execution, but through forced evacuation that functioned as extermination by exhaustion, exposure, and gunfire, beginning in early April 1945 and accelerating as American units advanced through southern Germany. Thousands upon thousands of prisoners were driven out of Dachau and its sub-camps on foot or packed into rail transports, forming long, skeletal columns that wound through Bavarian villages and countryside, watched by civilians who later claimed confusion or ignorance but who could not avoid seeing men collapse into ditches, bodies left by roadsides, and guards shooting those who could no longer walk. These death marches were chaotic and brutal, organized with minimal planning, almost no food, and no medical care as SS guards. Many themselves exhausted, frightened, and uncertain, enforced movement through violence, striking prisoners with rifle butts, shooting stragglers, and abandoning the sick to die where they fell. For the prisoners, the marches represented a cruel paradox. Movement suggested escape from the camp, Yet every step drained the last reserves of strength from bodies already destroyed by starvation and disease, and many understood that the SS intended the marches not as rescue from the front lines but as a way to eliminate witnesses before liberation. Nights were spent in open fields, barns, or roadside ditches, often without shelter, while guards slept in nearby buildings, reinforcing the hierarchy of life even in the regime's final hours. Those who attempted to drink from streams or ponds often fell ill from contaminated water, and typhus followed the columns as relentlessly as the guards, killing silently during brief rests. Some marches dissolved into confusion as command broke down, with guards deserting or fleeing when Allied aircraft appeared, leaving prisoners wandering without direction, uncertain whether to hide, surrender, or continue moving in hopes of finding safety. Others ended in mass graves, as SS units, panicked by approaching troops, executed entire groups rather than risk capture. Railway evacuations proved no less lethal, with prisoners sealed into boxcars without food, water, or sanitation, turning trains into rolling coffins where death came through suffocation, dehydration, and disease, and where the living often arrived riding alongside the dead. It was during one such evacuation that the infamous death train from Buchenwald arrived near Dachau, its cars filled with decomposing bodies, a mobile mass grave that would later confront American liberators with undeniable evidence of systematic murder. Inside Dachau itself, the removal of large prisoner groups created a temporary illusion of reduced overcrowding, but this was quickly overwhelmed by continued arrivals from other camps, ensuring that suffering intensified rather than eased. For those marched away, survival often depended on moments of chance. A sympathetic civilian offering water, a guard who looked away, a sudden air raid that scattered escorts. Yet even these moments carried danger, as anyone caught accepting help or breaking formation risked immediate execution. Long after the war, survivors would describe the marches as among the most traumatic experiences of their imprisonment, not only for their physical brutality, but for the psychological torment of moving endlessly toward an unknown fate while watching friends die step by step, unable to help or even mourn. The death marches exposed the final truth of the Nazi camp system. When ideology collapsed and command disintegrated, the impulse to destroy prisoners remained, proving that the camps were not aberrations of wartime chaos but deliberate instruments of annihilation, capable of killing even as the state that built them fell apart. By the time American forces reached Dachau, thousands who had been imprisoned there were already dead along roads, in forests, and in fields across Bavaria, their bodies unmarked and unnamed, victims of a final campaign designed not to win a war, but to ensure that as few witnesses as possible lived to describe what Dachau truly was. Chapter 4, Segment 3, Liberation, Shock, and the Collapse of Order. When American forces finally reached Dachau on April 29, 1945, they did not enter a battlefield in the traditional sense, nor did they encounter a functioning prison that could be methodically secured and processed. Instead, they walked directly into the physical and moral wreckage of a system that had already collapsed inward, leaving behind a landscape of death so overwhelming that it defied anything most soldiers had seen in combat. And the first signal that something was profoundly wrong came not from gunfire or resistance, but from smell. A thick, sickening stench of decay that hung in the air long before the camp itself came into view, growing stronger as troops advanced along the rail line leading to Dachau, where they encountered the freight cars of the so-called death train, boxcars sealed from the outside and filled not with supplies or prisoners awaiting processing, but with hundreds of decomposing bodies stacked together, men who had died slowly during transport from Buchenwald and other camps, abandoned where the train had been left as the SS fled. For many soldiers, this moment shattered any remaining abstraction about Nazi crimes, turning rumors and intelligence reports into undeniable reality. And when the camp gates were opened, the shock only deepened as American troops confronted skeletal survivors behind barbed wire, men barely able to stand, staring in disbelief at their liberators. unsure whether this moment marked salvation or another cruel illusion. Inside the camp, corpses lay unburied in courtyards, barracks, and along pathways, some covered hastily with blankets, others left exposed. Their emaciated forms a silent record of starvation and disease, while the crematoria stood clogged and overwhelmed, incapable of keeping pace with the death toll of the preceding weeks. Order had disintegrated entirely. SS guards had fled, surrendered, or hidden among prisoners, while surviving inmates moved through the camp in states of shock. Grief and exhaustion, some laughing, some crying, others too weak to react at all. American medics and officers were immediately confronted with a crisis unlike any they had trained for, as thousands of survivors required urgent care, yet feeding them improperly risked killing them through refeeding syndrome, a danger not yet fully understood, while typhus threatened to spread beyond the camp if not contained. At the same time, rage surged among some American soldiers, fueled by what they had witnessed, and in the chaotic hours following liberation, a number of captured SS personnel were shot by U.S. troops in incidents that would later become the subject of an official military investigation, illustrating how the moral shock of Dachau reverberated even among those who came as liberators. For the survivors, liberation did not mean immediate relief. Many continued to die in the days and weeks that followed, their bodies too damaged by starvation and disease to recover even with care, turning Dachau into a place of continued mourning long after the guards were gone. The camp was quickly sealed off as a quarantine zone, and medical teams worked desperately to control typhus outbreaks, sanitize facilities, and document conditions before evidence could be lost, photographing bodies, barracks, and infrastructure to preserve proof of what had occurred, knowing that denial would follow as surely as memory faded. Survivors were interviewed, their testimonies recorded while voices were still strong enough to speak, laying the groundwork for future war crimes prosecutions and shaping the historical understanding of the camp system as a whole. Dachau, once the model for Nazi terror, now became one of the first places where that terror was fully exposed to the outside world, not through propaganda or enemy claims, but through the stunned reactions of Allied soldiers and journalists who struggled to find language adequate to describe what they saw. Newspapers and newsreels carried images of Dachau across the world, forcing civilian populations to confront the reality of crimes committed in their name or ignored for years, and transforming the camp into a symbol of what the Nazi regime truly represented at its end. Not strength or order, but decay, cruelty, and moral collapse. Yet even as the camp passed into Allied control, the question of responsibility loomed unresolved, as survivors faced the painful reality that many perpetrators had escaped, that justice would be slow and incomplete, and that memory itself would require constant defense against minimization and forgetting. Dachau's liberation did not close the chapter of suffering. It opened a new and difficult one, in which the task was no longer survival under oppression, but survival with memory, testimony, and trauma, ensuring that what had happened inside the barbed wire would not dissolve into rumor or denial, but remain fixed in history as evidence of what human systems can become when cruelty is organized, normalized, and allowed to persist unchecked. Chapter 5, Segment 1. Reckoning begins, from liberation to the search for justice. In the days immediately following the liberation of Dachau, the camp did not simply transform from a place of terror into a place of peace. Instead, it became the center of an urgent and unprecedented reckoning, as Allied authorities realized that what they had uncovered was not an isolated crime scene but part of a vast, systematic network of atrocities that demanded documentation, accountability, and justice on a scale never before attempted. And the first task was stabilization. Medical teams raced against time to save tens of thousands of survivors whose bodies had been pushed beyond human limits, administering carefully controlled nourishment, isolating typhus patients, burning contaminated clothing, and converting former SS facilities into emergency hospitals, all while death continued to claim lives daily from complications that could no longer be reversed. Alongside this medical emergency ran a parallel effort just as critical: the preservation of evidence as military. Investigators, photographers, and legal officers meticulously recorded barracks conditions, crematoria, execution sites, administrative records, and mass graves, understanding that these materials would soon become the backbone of future war crimes trials and that without them, the truth could be distorted, denied, or erased. Dachau, because it had been liberated largely intact and because of its status as the first concentration camp built by the Nazis, was quickly recognized as a central symbol of the entire camp system, and this symbolic weight would soon shape how justice unfolded. American authorities gathered survivors and compelled nearby German civilians to walk through the camp, forcing them to confront the physical reality of what had occurred in their vicinity, a deliberate act intended to shatter claims of ignorance and expose the consequences of silence and complicity. And while some civilians reacted with disbelief or horror, others displayed denial or emotional detachment, responses that revealed how deeply normalized cruelty had become under the regime. As order slowly returned, attention turned toward identifying perpetrators. SS guards, camp officials, doctors, administrators, and capos who had abused their authority. And while many senior figures had fled, committed suicide, or blended into the chaos of Germany's collapse, hundreds of Dachau personnel were captured and detained, setting the stage for one of the earliest and most significant war crimes proceedings held by the United States Army. The Dachau trials, which began later in 1945, represented a new legal frontier, operating under the principle that participation in a criminal system itself constituted culpability, even without direct evidence of individual acts of murder, a concept that challenged traditional legal norms but reflected the reality of how mass atrocity functioned. Survivors were called to testify, often reliving trauma as they described beatings, executions, medical experiments, starvation, and terror, their words forming a living bridge between suffering and justice, while the defendants frequently claimed they were merely following orders, a defense that would become emblematic of the moral evasions exposed during the post-war reckoning. These trials were not without controversy. Questions of due process, victor's justice, and emotional influence were raised even at the time, but they marked a decisive shift in international law, reinforcing the idea that crimes against humanity could not be shielded by uniforms, rank, or obedience. Beyond the courtroom, Dachau became a place of reflection and confrontation for the wider world, as journalists, political leaders, clergy, and humanitarian organizations visited the site, each struggling to interpret what it represented for the future of civilization, and for survivors, liberation brought a painful dual reality. Freedom intertwined with loss, as many discovered that families had been annihilated, homes destroyed, and communities erased, leaving them displaced in a world that could not easily absorb their grief. Displaced persons camps emerged across Germany, including at Dachau itself, where former prisoners now lived temporarily in the very space that had once imprisoned them, attempting to rebuild identity, dignity, and purpose amid ruins. Memory, too, became contested terrain. Some voices urged forgetting in the name of rebuilding, while survivors and advocates insisted that remembrance was essential, not only to honor the dead but to prevent repetition. And it was in this fragile moment that Dachau's meaning began to shift from active site of terror to enduring symbol of warning, a transformation that would shape how the Holocaust was understood, taught, and commemorated in the decades to come. The camp's history no longer belonged only to those who had suffered within its fences, but to humanity itself, as evidence of what happens when ideology dehumanizes, bureaucracy obeys without conscience, and societies tolerate the gradual erosion of moral boundaries, setting the stage for the long, unfinished struggle between memory and forgetting that would define Dachau's legacy long after the last witness spoke. Chapter 5, Segment 2, Memory Under Threat, Denial, Displacement, and the Struggle to Tell the Truth. As the immediate shock of liberation faded, a quieter and more insidious battle began around Dachau. A battle over memory, responsibility, and truth, because while the physical structures of terror stood plainly visible, the meaning of what they represented was already being contested, reshaped, and in some cases deliberately obscured. For survivors, the end of Nazi rule did not bring clarity or closure, but instead opened a disorienting chapter marked by displacement, uncertainty, and the painful realization that survival itself came with no clear destination, as many found themselves stateless, homeless, and psychologically shattered, caught between the ruins of the past and an unwelcoming future. Displaced persons camps filled with former prisoners who could not return home, either because their families had been murdered, their towns destroyed, or because anti-Semitism and hostility still awaited them, and Dachau itself briefly became such a place, its barracks repurposed to shelter those who had nowhere else to go, creating a bitter irony in which victims now inhabited the very space designed to annihilate them. At the same time, across Germany and beyond, a powerful urge emerged to move on quickly, to rebuild cities, economies, and national identities without fully confronting the moral catastrophe that had occurred, and this urge often translated into silence, minimization, or outright denial, with former Nazis reintegrating into civilian life, bureaucrats returning to offices, and neighbors insisting they had known nothing, seen nothing, and been powerless to intervene. Dachau, however, resisted erasure precisely because of the evidence preserved there. The photographs, documents, survivor testimonies, and physical remains that made denial increasingly untenable. Yet even so, the narrative of what Dachau meant became fragmented, as some framed it as an aberration caused by a few fanatics rather than the product of a society-wide collapse of ethics. This struggle over interpretation extended into education and public memory, where early post-war curricula often treated the camps superficially or avoided them altogether, reflecting a broader discomfort with confronting collective guilt. Survivors, many still physically weak and emotionally traumatized, carried the burden of remembrance largely alone, forming associations, recording testimonies, and speaking publicly despite the immense personal cost, driven by the fear that if they did not tell their stories, no one else would, and that the dead would vanish a second time, this time into forgetting. Meanwhile, Cold War politics complicated remembrance further, as Germany's rapid integration into the Western Bloc shifted priorities towards stability and anti-communism, sometimes at the expense of deeper reckoning with Nazi crimes, and Dachau's role as a symbol of terror risked being overshadowed by new geopolitical anxieties. Yet resistance to forgetting persisted, slowly gaining institutional support through memorial initiatives, historical commissions, and the growing recognition that sites like Dachau were not merely relics of the past but moral reference points for the present. Debates raged over whether the camp should be demolished to erase its dark association or preserved as evidence and warning, and the eventual decision to maintain Dachau as a memorial was neither immediate nor unanimous, reflecting lingering unease about confronting such a stark mirror of human capacity for cruelty. As years passed, survivor numbers dwindled, intensifying the urgency of documentation and education, and Dachau increasingly became a place where absence spoke as loudly as presence. The absence of voices silenced forever, of families never rebuilt, of futures never lived. Denial did not disappear, however, but adapted, taking new forms through pseudo-historical arguments, selective skepticism, and conspiracy theories that attempted to cast doubt on victim accounts or reduce the scale of crimes, underscoring that memory is not self-sustaining but requires active defense. In this climate, Dachau stood as both evidence and battleground, its existence challenging comfortable narratives and forcing societies to confront uncomfortable truths about obedience, conformity, and moral failure. The camp's transformation into a memorial site marked a critical step in institutionalizing remembrance, but it also raised difficult questions about how to represent suffering without exploiting it, how to educate without numbing, and how to honor victims without turning atrocity into abstraction. Through exhibitions, guided tours, and archival work, Dachau began to function as a place of learning rather than imprisonment. Yet its atmosphere remained heavy with the weight of what had occurred, reminding visitors that the past was not distant or abstract but embedded in real spaces shaped by real choices. This phase of Dachau's history reveals that the end of killing did not mean the end of danger, because forgetting, denial, and moral complacency posed their own threats, capable of eroding the lessons paid for with millions of lives. And it was within this fragile tension, between remembrance and erasure, accountability and avoidance, that Dachau's legacy continued to evolve, shaping how future generations would understand not only the Holocaust, but the responsibilities that come with freedom, knowledge, and historical truth. Chapter 5, Segment 3. From Crime Scene to Conscience, Dachau's Enduring Legacy. Over time, Dachau underwent a profound transformation, not in bricks and barbed wire alone, but in meaning, evolving from a place engineered to crush human beings into a site tasked with preserving human conscience. And this transformation was neither smooth nor inevitable, because turning a landscape of terror into a space of education required societies to make deliberate choices about truth, responsibility, and the kind of future they wished to build. As memorialization efforts expanded, Dachau became a focal point for historians, educators, and survivors who recognized that the camp's true significance lay not only in what happened there, but in what it revealed about modern power, obedience, and the fragility of moral norms under authoritarian rule. The camp's history demonstrated that mass atrocity did not require chaos or madness, but rather organization, paperwork, discipline, and the quiet cooperation of ordinary people performing ordinary tasks within an extraordinary system of violence. This realization reshaped how Dachau was taught and remembered, shifting emphasis from isolated cruelty to systemic responsibility, from villains alone to the broader structures that enabled them. Memorial exhibitions increasingly contextualized Dachau within the larger Nazi camp network, showing how it functioned as both a training ground and a model, exporting methods of terror across occupied Europe and embedding brutality into institutional routine. Visitors walking the grounds were no longer confronted only with the remnants of suffering, but with questions, implicit and explicit, about complicity, silence, and moral choice, questions that refused to remain confined to the past. At the same time, Dachau's legacy became inseparable from the voices of survivors who continued, often into old age, to guide tours, give testimony, and confront audiences with lived reality rather than abstract numbers, insisting that remembrance must remain personal if it was to remain meaningful. These encounters forged a direct link between generations, collapsing the distance between history and the present, and making it impossible to dismiss Dachau as merely something that happened long ago. Yet, as decades passed, the challenge of memory deepened, because the living witnesses who anchored the camp's story in human experience began to disappear, leaving behind recordings, texts, and artifacts that carried truth but lacked the immediacy of presence, forcing institutions to grapple with how remembrance could endure without survivors to speak. This transition intensified debates about representation, how to convey suffering without sensationalism, how to avoid reducing victims to symbols, and how to prevent sites like Dachau from becoming static museums rather than active moral spaces. In response, educational programs increasingly emphasized critical thinking, encouraging visitors to analyze how propaganda, fear, and conformity operate in any society, not only Nazi Germany, and to recognize early warning signs of dehumanization in contemporary contexts. Dachau thus became not only a memorial to past victims, but a warning embedded in the present, reminding visitors that the conditions that produced the camp, exclusionary ideology, unchecked authority, and the erosion of legal protections, can emerge wherever power is allowed to override humanity. Internationally, Dachau's preservation influenced how other former campsites were treated, reinforcing the principle that places of atrocity should be protected as evidence and lessons rather than erased for comfort. and contributing to a broader global culture of Holocaust remembrance that linked memory with human rights advocacy. Nevertheless, the camp's legacy remained contested, periodically challenged by political movements seeking to relativize Nazi crimes or frame remembrance as an obstacle to national pride, illustrating that the struggle over Dachau's meaning was ongoing rather than settled. Each act of denial, distortion, or trivialization underscored why the site's existence mattered, because Dachau stood as a rebuttal carved into the landscape itself, an answer to those who claimed such crimes were exaggerated or impossible. Today, walking through Dachau is an experience defined as much by absence as by presence. The absence of the millions who never lived to see freedom, the absence of voices silenced by violence, but also by continuity, because the camp's story continues to shape ethical discussions about state power, civil courage, and the responsibility of individuals within systems. Dachau's enduring legacy lies in this tension. It is a place where humanity reached a moral abyss, yet also a place where remembrance insists that such descent is neither natural nor inevitable. By preserving Dachau, societies accept an uncomfortable inheritance, the duty to remember not only the victims, but the choices that led to their suffering, and to recognize that the true measure of never again is not found in monuments alone, but in vigilance, empathy, and the willingness to confront injustice before it becomes policy. In this way, Dachau remains unfinished history, not because its facts are incomplete, but because its meaning continues to unfold, demanding engagement from every generation that passes through its gates, asking not what happened here, but what we will do with the knowledge of it. Chapter 6, Segment 1, Evacuation, Collapse, and the Machinery of Death Without Walls. As the Third Reich began to fracture under the weight of Allied advances in early 1945, Dachau entered its final and most lethal phase, not marked by gas chambers or formal execution orders, but by a systematic collapse engineered through evacuation, abandonment, and calculated cruelty that extended the camp's reach far beyond its fences. With the Eastern Front disintegrating and Soviet forces advancing rapidly, the SS initiated massive evacuations of camps across occupied Europe, funneling tens of thousands of prisoners westward toward Dachau and its satellite camps, transforming the entire region into a moving landscape of death where exhaustion, hunger, exposure, and bullets became tools of extermination. Dachau, already overcrowded and collapsing under its own infrastructure, was suddenly flooded with prisoners from Buchenwald, Flossenburg, Mauthausen, and countless smaller subcamps, each transport bringing men who were already skeletal, diseased, and broken by months or years of forced labor and brutality. Barracks designed for a few hundred now contained thousands, sleeping stacked on bare planks or concrete floors, bodies pressed together not for warmth but because there was no space left to lie down, while food rations, already insufficient, were stretched into near-nothingness, often reduced to thin liquid that provided no sustenance and accelerated starvation. Sanitation systems failed entirely, latrines overflowed, clean water became scarce, and lice spread. Unchecked, carrying typhus through the camp with devastating speed, turning Dachau into an epidemiological catastrophe that the SS neither prevented nor meaningfully addressed. Medical care was non-existent except in name, and prisoners weakened by hunger had no resistance left, collapsing in barracks, roll call squares, and work details, their bodies left where they fell for hours or days because there were no longer enough living prisoners to remove the dead. Crematoria operated continuously, yet could not keep pace with mortality, forcing corpses to be piled in courtyards, hallways, and near barracks, creating a constant presence of death that stripped away any remaining illusion of survival. At the same time, the SS intensified evacuations outward from Dachau, initiating brutal death marches across Bavaria as Allied forces closed in, pushing prisoners on foot through snow, rain, and freezing nights with almost no food, shooting those who collapsed or lagged behind, leaving bodies scattered along roadsides, in forests, and in villages that became unwilling witnesses to the regime's final crimes. These marches were not chaotic improvisations but deliberate efforts to remove witnesses, prevent liberation, and continue extermination under the guise of evacuation, revealing that even as Nazi authority collapsed, its commitment to destruction remained intact. Prisoners were herded into columns guarded by increasingly desperate SS men, some fanatical to the end, others fearful and brutal in their panic, creating an environment where violence became arbitrary and constant, with survival dependent on chance, strength, and the mercy of guards who rarely showed any. Trains were also used, sealing prisoners into freight cars without ventilation, water, or sanitation, turning railways into mobile mass graves as starvation, dehydration, and disease claimed thousands before destinations were reached. One such transport, the now infamous death train from Buchenwald, arrived at Dachau in late April 1945, its boxcars packed with decomposing corpses and a handful of survivors barely clinging to life, an image that would later become one of the most haunting symbols of the camp's final days. These evacuations revealed the true nature of Dachau's last phase. Extermination without walls, where the camp's function expanded into the surrounding countryside, dissolving the boundary between prisoner and landscape, turning roads, fields, and villages into extensions of the camp system itself. Civilians encountered columns of prisoners staggering past their homes, heard gunshots in nearby forests, and saw bodies left behind, confronting the reality of Nazi crimes even as official denial persisted, making it increasingly impossible to claim ignorance. Inside Dachau, those left behind awaited an uncertain fate as rumors spread of approaching Allied troops, executions, and potential mass killings to erase evidence, creating an atmosphere of terror and fragile hope that coexisted uneasily because survival no longer depended on endurance alone but on timing, on whether liberation would arrive before the SS carried out final orders. This period stripped away any remaining pretense that Dachau was a labor camp or detention center, exposing it fully as a mechanism of destruction that functioned through deprivation, displacement, and neglect as effectively as through overt violence. The final weeks before liberation thus represented not a winding down of atrocities but their concentration, compressed into a relentless crescendo of death that demonstrated how modern systems could kill even as they collapsed, and how the absence of restraint, accountability, or humanity could transform retreat into massacre. Dachau in these last days was no longer merely a place. It was a process unfolding in motion, a system unraveling while still killing, revealing with brutal clarity that the Holocaust did not end when the war turned against Nazi Germany, but continued until the moment force intervened to stop it. Chapter 6, Segment 2, Liberation Approaches, Evidence of the Crime, and the Shattering Encounter with Reality. By late April 1945, as American forces pushed deeper into Bavaria, the collapse of Nazi control around Dachau accelerated into a final, chaotic phase defined by fear, concealment, and desperation. As SS authorities realized that liberation was no longer a distant threat but an imminent certainty, and with that realization came a frantic effort not to save lives but to obscure crimes, erase evidence, and remove witnesses. Orders circulated unevenly through the camp system, some contradictory, others terrifyingly vague, creating a volatile environment where guards alternated between fleeing their posts, enforcing brutal discipline, or preparing for mass evacuation or execution scenarios that never fully materialized but haunted every remaining prisoner. Inside the camp, inmates sensed that something decisive was approaching, not through official announcements but through subtle signs. Guards abandoning watchtowers, administrative offices hastily burned, files destroyed, valuables looted, and SS personnel changing into civilian clothes or Wehrmacht uniforms in an attempt to disappear into the chaos of defeat. Yet even as authority fractured, killing did not stop. Prisoners continued to die daily from starvation, disease, and exhaustion, and shootings still occurred during roll calls or work details, underscoring that the system's momentum carried violence forward even when its architects were retreating. The camp's infrastructure, already overwhelmed, was now entirely non-functional, with electricity intermittent or gone, water systems failing, and medical facilities reduced to rooms of the dying, where skeletal men lay packed together, too weak to move or speak, surrounded by the smell of decay and untreated infection. Corpses accumulated faster than they could be removed, stacked near barracks or left where they fell, and the presence of death became so constant that prisoners no longer reacted with shock but with numb resignation, conserving energy for survival rather than mourning. Beyond the camp gates, death marches continued to funnel prisoners away from approaching Allied lines, while others, too weak to march, were left behind, effectively sentenced to die where they lay, revealing the SS' calculated indifference toward life and their singular focus on denial and evasion. Meanwhile, American reconnaissance units began encountering scattered groups of liberated prisoners, abandoned columns, and roadside graves, piecing together fragments of a vast crime that extended far beyond any single camp, yet nothing prepared them for what awaited at Dachau itself. On April 29, 1945, U.S. Army units of the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions approached the camp, initially encountering the infamous train on a siding near the camp perimeter, where boxcars stood open to reveal hundreds of decomposing bodies, men who had died slowly during transport from Buchenwald, creating a visceral shock that shattered any remaining abstraction about Nazi brutality and immediately transformed the liberation from a military operation into a confrontation with atrocity. When American troops entered the campgrounds, they were met not by resistance but by silence broken only by the weak movements of survivors and the overwhelming stench of death, a sensory assault that conveyed the scale of crime more powerfully than words or reports ever could. Behind barbed wire stood thousands of prisoners, skeletal and disoriented, some too weak to comprehend that their ordeal had ended, others collapsing in tears or attempting to approach their liberators with the last reserves of strength, while around them lay piles of corpses, open crematoria, and barracks filled with the dying. The shock experienced by the liberators quickly turned into rage, confusion, and moral injury, as soldiers confronted not an enemy army but the evidence of systematic murder, leading in some instances to the killing of captured SS guards in moments of uncontrolled fury, acts that would later be investigated by the U.S. Army but which reflected the psychological toll of encountering crimes of such magnitude. Liberation, however, did not mean immediate safety for the survivors, because Dachau remained a place of death even after the SS were gone, as thousands hovered on the edge of starvation, disease, and organ failure, requiring urgent medical intervention that Allied forces were not initially equipped to provide. American medical personnel faced the immense challenge of stabilizing tens of thousands of prisoners suffering from severe malnutrition, typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis, while also preventing fatal refeeding syndrome, a poorly understood condition in which weakened bodies collapse when given normal food too quickly, forcing doctors to invent treatment protocols on the spot amid overwhelming conditions. The camp had to be quarantined, disinfected, and reorganized, turning former instruments of oppression into emergency hospitals and triage centers, while survivors were slowly reintroduced to nourishment, sanitation, and basic care. Simultaneously, military authorities began documenting the camp in detail, photographing corpses, recording survivor testimony, preserving structures, and gathering physical evidence, recognizing that Dachau would become not only a humanitarian crisis but a central exhibit in the prosecution of Nazi crimes, a role it would soon fulfill during the Dachau trials. For survivors, liberation brought a complex mix of relief, grief, disorientation, and fear, as many learned that their families were gone, their homes destroyed, and their future uncertain, leaving them suspended between the end of suffering and the beginning of a long, painful reckoning. Dachau's liberation thus marked not a clean conclusion but a transition, from hidden crime to exposed truth, from systematic killing to historical evidence, and from enforced silence to testimony, ensuring that what had occurred within its walls could no longer be denied, minimized, or erased, even as the human cost of those final months continued to unfold long after the gates were opened. Chapter 6, Segment 3: Reckoning, Memory, and the Long Shadow of Dachau's Final Months. In the weeks and months following liberation, Dachau did not simply fade into history as a closed chapter of war, but became a living crime scene, a place where the consequences of systematic cruelty continued to unfold long after the SS had vanished, and where the final months of chaos, death, and abandonment demanded answers, accountability, and remembrance. American forces, now fully aware that Dachau represented not an anomaly but a blueprint for Nazi terror, transformed the camp from a site of suffering into a center for documentation and justice, preserving barracks, crematoria, and execution grounds as physical testimony while collecting thousands of survivor statements that described not only years of imprisonment but the uniquely catastrophic collapse of the camp in its last phase. Investigators walked through rooms where corpses had been stacked days earlier, examined mass graves hastily filled by fleeing guards, and traced the routes of death marches whose victims lay scattered across Bavaria, understanding that Dachau's final months were not a breakdown of order, but the system's logical endpoint. Violence continuing even as authority disintegrated. Survivors, meanwhile, faced a new struggle that few had anticipated. Surviving survival itself, as weakened bodies succumbed to illness even after liberation, and psychological trauma surfaced in waves, with nightmares, disorientation, guilt, and grief overwhelming men and women who had endured too much to immediately reclaim a sense of normal life. Many could not comprehend freedom, asking guards for permission to move or hiding food under mattresses, habits ingrained by years of terror, while others searched desperately for relatives who would never be found, their fates sealed in the evacuations, the crematoria, or the final transports. Dachau became a temporary refuge for displaced persons, a holding place where survivors waited for news, medical clearance, or the chance to emigrate, all while living among the ruins of the system that had nearly destroyed them. At the same time, the camp served as the setting for one of the earliest and most significant war crimes prosecutions, as U.S. military tribunals convened the Dachau trials beginning in late 1945, bringing former SS guards, doctors, administrators, and capos before the court to answer for crimes committed not only over years but specifically during the camp's final, most lethal phase. Testimony revealed how starvation was calculated, how typhus was allowed to spread unchecked, how executions continued even when defeat was inevitable, and how evacuation orders were carried out with ruthless disregard for human life, shattering any defense that atrocities were the result of chaos rather than intent. The trials established a crucial legal precedent by recognizing that systemic cruelty, neglect, and deliberate deprivation constituted crimes against humanity, even in the absence of gas chambers, and Dachau became central to the world's understanding that genocide could be executed through bureaucracy and abandonment as effectively as through direct killing. Yet justice was incomplete as many perpetrators escaped prosecution, blended into civilian life, or benefited from the Cold War's shifting priorities, leaving survivors with the bitter knowledge that accountability would never fully match the scale of suffering. Over time, Dachau transitioned from a site of prosecution to a place of memory. Its barracks cleared, its grounds reshaped into a memorial, not to sanitize the past but to confront it, ensuring that visitors would walk the same paths, see the same structures, and confront the same evidence that once stood before liberators and investigators. The final months of Dachau became a focal point in historical scholarship, illustrating how genocide does not end when defeat is certain, but often intensifies as perpetrators attempt to erase witnesses and records, and how liberation itself can arrive amid death rather than after it. For historians, Dachau's collapse demonstrated that the Holocaust was not only a series of planned extermination actions, but a sustained culture of dehumanization that persisted until the very last days of the regime, consuming victims even as the Nazi state imploded. For survivors, Dachau remained both a place of horror and a point of reference, where the world finally saw what had been hidden, and where their suffering could no longer be dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. Memory, however, proved fragile, challenged by denial, distortion, and the passage of time, making Dachau's preservation and education efforts essential in countering attempts to minimize or relativize the crimes committed there. The final months, with their death trains, overcrowded barracks, uncontrolled disease, and frantic evacuations, stand today as a warning about how quickly moral boundaries collapse when human beings are reduced to numbers, and how systems built on exclusion and hatred do not simply stop when they fail, but continue to kill until they are forcibly dismantled. Dachau's legacy, therefore, extends beyond its gates, beyond its liberation, and beyond its trials, serving as enduring evidence that mass atrocity is not an accident of war but the result of choices made repeatedly, even when collapse is inevitable, and that remembering those final months is not an act of dwelling on the past, but a necessary defense against the conditions that allow such crimes to be repeated in any era. Chapter 7, Segment 1. Dachau as a symbol, a warning, and a measure of human collapse. As the immediate aftermath of liberation receded and the dead were buried, Dachau began to take on a meaning far larger than the barbed wire and concrete that still scarred the Bavarian landscape, evolving into a symbol through which the world attempted to understand not only what had happened there, but how an entire society had allowed such a place to exist, function, and reach its most lethal intensity in the final months of the war. Historians, journalists, military officials, and civilians streamed through the former camp, confronting evidence that defied comprehension. Rows of bunks where starvation had hollowed bodies into skeletons, crematoria that told of bodies burned faster than records could be kept, and administrative buildings that revealed how murder had been organized with forms, schedules, and signatures. Dachau was no longer merely a concentration camp. It became a reference point, a grim yardstick against which other camps were measured, because it had been the first permanent Nazi camp and, in many ways, the last to collapse, encapsulating the full arc of the system from ideological experiment to terminal disintegration. The final months in particular drew intense scrutiny, as scholars recognized that Dachau's end-stage horrors illustrated the true nature of Nazi terror more clearly than its earlier, more structured phases, exposing how deprivation, overcrowding, disease, and indifference could be weaponized just as effectively as bullets or gas, and how a system designed to dominate bodies ultimately abandoned them when they were no longer useful. The narrative that emerged challenged the comforting myth that atrocities were confined to distant killing centers or secret operations, instead revealing that mass death unfolded openly, visibly, and relentlessly even as Germany's defeat was obvious, implicating not only SS guards but civilian administrators, transport officials, industrial suppliers, and local populations who saw trains pass, smelled the smoke, and heard rumors yet largely remained silent. Dachau's post-war transformation into a memorial was therefore not merely an act of preservation, but a deliberate confrontation with collective responsibility, forcing visitors to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that the camp functioned for 12 years in full view of a modern European society. Educational programs emphasized the final months because they stripped away excuses. There was no longer ideology to rally behind, no military necessity to claim, no victory to justify sacrifice, only a collapsing regime continuing to kill because killing had become routine. Survivors who returned to Dachau for commemorations spoke of this phase with particular pain, describing how hope briefly flickered as Allied forces approached, only to be crushed by death marches, sealed trains, and the spread of disease, underscoring the cruelty of a system that prolonged suffering even when liberation was imminent. Their testimonies highlighted a profound moral lesson, that the most dangerous stage of mass violence may come not at its beginning, but at its end, when perpetrators act with desperation, denial, and the belief that nothing remains to restrain them. Dachau thus entered global consciousness not only as evidence of Nazi crimes, but as a case study in how institutions fail catastrophically when law, ethics, and humanity are subordinated to obedience and ideology, and how ordinary administrative decisions, reducing rations, delaying evacuations, ignoring disease, can produce mass death without a single explicit order to kill. In classrooms, courtrooms, and memorial ceremonies, Dachau's final months became central to discussions about genocide prevention, warning that warning signs are often visible long before violence reaches its peak, and that the dismantling of safeguards rarely happens all at once, but through gradual normalization of cruelty. The camp's history challenged post-war societies to ask difficult questions about compliance and resistance, about the limits of survival under terror, and about the responsibilities of witnesses who live nearby yet claim ignorance. As decades passed, the urgency of memory faced new threats from denial, relativization, and the fading of living testimony, making Dachau's preserved ruins and documented final months ever more crucial as tangible proof that these events were not abstractions, but lived realities measured in bodies, days, and decisions. The camp's legacy also extended into contemporary human rights discourse, informing international law, shaping definitions of crimes against humanity, and reinforcing the principle that neglect and abandonment can be as lethal as direct violence, especially when applied systematically. In this way, Dachau's end did not mark a conclusion, but a beginning of remembrance, accountability, and an ongoing struggle to ensure that the conditions which allowed such a place to reach its deadliest phase are recognized and challenged wherever they arise. The final months stand as a stark reminder that the collapse of a regime does not automatically restore morality, and that liberation, when it finally comes, often arrives not to a scene of relief, but to one of devastation that demands truth, courage, and an unflinching commitment to remember. Chapter 7, Segment 2: Testimony, Justice, and the Struggle to Name What Happened. In the months following liberation, Dachau became not only a site of mourning but a crucible for testimony. As survivors, many still weakened by starvation, typhus, and trauma, were asked to do something almost unbearable: to speak, to remember, and to translate experiences of systematic cruelty into words that courts and commissions could understand, a process that revealed how fragile truth can be when confronted by bureaucratic language and legal procedure. Allied investigators photographed the camp, cataloged corpses, measured crematoria, and gathered documents. Yet they quickly realized that evidence alone could not convey the lived reality of Dachau's final months, when death arrived through exhaustion, disease, and neglect rather than a single weapon, forcing prosecutors to grapple with crimes that were diffuse, cumulative, and often executed through omission rather than explicit command. Survivors described how overcrowding turned barracks into incubators of disease, how rations collapsed into thin soup that prolonged life just enough to allow suffering to continue, how guards enforced order even as the system disintegrated, and how the SS continued evacuations and marches despite knowing the war was lost. A pattern that exposed the persistence of ideology and obedience beyond any rational military goal. These accounts challenged traditional notions of culpability, because responsibility did not rest solely with those who pulled triggers, but with administrators who delayed medical care, officers who ignored typhus outbreaks, transport officials who sealed trains, and commanders who prioritized secrecy over survival, revealing a chain of decisions that transformed Dachau into a killing environment without a single decisive act. The Dachau trials, convened by U.S. military courts, attempted to confront this complexity by prosecuting camp personnel for war crimes, yet the proceedings themselves highlighted the limits of post-war justice, as judges and juries struggled to quantify suffering and to distinguish between degrees of guilt within a system designed to diffuse responsibility. Some defendants claimed they were mere functionaries, others invoked obedience to orders, and still others minimized conditions by pointing to the chaos of the war's end, defenses that forced the court to articulate a crucial principle: that participation in a criminal system, even without direct violence, constitutes culpability when one knowingly enables mass suffering. Survivors who testified often did so at great personal cost, reliving the final months when hope rose and fell with rumors of Allied advances, when friends died hours before liberation, and when the camp's collapse intensified rather than alleviated cruelty, their words carrying a moral weight that transcended legal outcomes and entered the historical record as warnings. Yet even as verdicts were handed down, a troubling pattern emerged in public reception, with some observers focusing narrowly on sensational images, the death train, the piles of bodies, while overlooking the systemic conditions that produced them, a selective memory that risked reducing Dachau to a singular horror rather than understanding it as the endpoint of a long process of normalization. Educators and historians pushed back against this simplification, emphasizing that the final months were not an aberration but a revelation, exposing how a regime that began with legal discrimination and social exclusion ended with mass death through abandonment, and how such outcomes are often facilitated by ordinary administrative routines. This interpretive struggle shaped how Dachau was presented to the public, with memorial curators deliberately highlighting survivor testimony alongside physical remains to counter denial and to humanize statistics, ensuring that visitors encountered not only what happened, but how it felt to endure hunger, disease, and uncertainty as the world closed. The camp's role in shaping international law also became clearer, as insights drawn from Dachau informed evolving definitions of crimes against humanity, underscoring that deliberate neglect and the creation of lethal living conditions are prosecutable acts, a principle later echoed in human rights conventions and tribunals. At the same time, survivors confronted a different kind of injustice as they returned to civilian life, facing disbelief, indifference, or pressure to remain silent in societies eager to move on, a dynamic that made Dachau's documented final months essential not only for courts, but for collective memory. The act of bearing witness thus became a form of resistance that continued long after liberation, asserting that the truth of Dachau could not be confined to verdicts or archives, but demanded ongoing engagement. As decades passed, new generations encountered Dachau through films, textbooks, and memorial visits, often encountering the final months first, because they were the most visually arresting, a tendency that educators sought to balance by contextualizing those images within the broader system of Nazi terror. This effort reflected a deeper ethical challenge: to remember without sensationalizing, to judge without simplifying, and to learn without distancing oneself from responsibility. Dachau's post-war story, shaped by testimony and trials, therefore stands as a reminder that justice is not a single event but a process, one that requires listening to uncomfortable truths and acknowledging how easily modern institutions can be turned toward destruction. The final months, illuminated by survivor voices, remain central to this lesson, because they show that even when collapse seems inevitable, human choices still matter, and that the refusal to abandon humanity, whether through testimony, remembrance, or accountability, can outlast the systems that sought to extinguish it. Chapter 7, Segment 3, Memory, Responsibility, and the Meaning of Dachau After the War. As the years passed and the immediate shock of liberation faded, Dachau entered a new and uneasy phase of existence, not as a functioning camp, but as a contested space of memory, responsibility, and moral reckoning, where the question was no longer how the camp operated, but what it meant, and how a place of systematic degradation could be integrated into a post-war world eager to rebuild and forget. In the early years after 1945, the site was repurposed in practical ways, housing displaced persons, refugees, and even former guards under Allied control, a transformation that unsettled survivors who feared that the physical traces of suffering would be erased just as the Nazis had attempted to erase their crimes, revealing how memory can be threatened not only by denial, but by neglect and normalization. Debates emerged over whether Dachau should remain standing as evidence or be dismantled to allow society to move forward, a tension that mirrored broader post-war struggles across Europe. where ruins symbolized both trauma and the desire for renewal. Survivors played a decisive role in shaping the outcome, insisting that Dachau must remain a place of witness, not closure, arguing that its preservation was essential precisely because the camp represented a system that had relied on gradual escalation and bureaucratic routine rather than sudden catastrophe. As memorialization efforts slowly took shape, they confronted the challenge of how to represent the final months. When death came through hunger, disease, and abandonment, conditions that lacked the immediate visual clarity of gas chambers, yet were no less intentional or lethal, forcing curators and historians to develop new ways of explaining extermination by neglect. The creation of the Dachau Memorial Site in the 1960s marked a turning point, institutionalizing remembrance while also raising difficult questions about narrative control, as official exhibitions risked flattening complexity into chronology, potentially obscuring the lived experience of prisoners who endured overcrowding, typhus, and the psychological torment of waiting for liberation that arrived too late for many. Survivor testimonies once again proved essential, anchoring abstract explanations in personal memory and resisting the tendency to reduce the final months to a prelude to liberation rather than recognizing them as a distinct phase of mass death. At the same time, Dachau became a reference point in global discussions about human rights, genocide prevention, and the responsibilities of modern states, with scholars and policymakers citing the camp as evidence that mass atrocity does not require secrecy or chaos, but can unfold within orderly systems governed by regulations, schedules, and professional roles. This recognition challenged comforting myths that evil is always extreme or irrational, instead exposing how ordinary structures, transport networks, medical hierarchies, administrative offices, can be repurposed to lethal ends when ideology overrides ethics. The final months of Dachau, in particular, underscored how the collapse of a regime does not automatically halt its crimes, demonstrating that violence can intensify in moments of desperation, fueled by fear, denial, and the urge to eliminate witnesses. This lesson resonated in later conflicts, where scholars and observers identified similar patterns of accelerated brutality during retreats and regime breakdowns, making Dachau a case study in the dangers of assuming that endings bring mercy. Education programs at the memorial increasingly emphasized this continuity, teaching visitors that liberation was not a clean break but a moment embedded within ongoing suffering, recovery, and long-term trauma. For survivors, memory remained both a burden and a duty, as many struggled with the moral weight of survival, the loss of families, and the knowledge that their testimonies would shape how Dachau was understood by generations who had not experienced war. Some spoke publicly, others remained silent, yet even silence became part of the historical record, reflecting the limits of language when confronted with experiences that defied comprehension. As denial and distortion emerged in various forms, the preserved evidence of Dachau's final months, documents, photographs, medical reports, and recorded testimonies, served as a bulwark against revisionism, demonstrating that remembrance requires constant vigilance rather than passive acknowledgement. The camp's legacy also forced confronting uncomfortable questions about complicity, as post-war societies reckoned with the fact that Dachau had operated for 12 years within a modern nation-state, often in full view of local populations, challenging narratives that placed all blame on a small group of fanatics. The final months, when death was visible, bodies accumulated, and transports arrived openly, stripped away any remaining illusions of ignorance, revealing how proximity does not guarantee intervention. Today, Dachau stands as both a memorial and a warning, its empty barracks and reconstructed fences conveying absence as powerfully as presence, inviting visitors to imagine not only the suffering that occurred, but the decisions that allowed it to continue until the very end. The story of Dachau does not conclude with liberation or trials, but with an ongoing responsibility to recognize how systems can be weaponized, how neglect can kill, and how memory must be actively sustained to prevent repetition. The final months, marked by starvation, disease, evacuation, and chaos, crystallize this lesson, showing that the most devastating crimes are often those that unfold slowly, normalized step by step, until they become indistinguishable from routine. Remembering Dachau, therefore, is not about preserving a relic of the past, but about maintaining an ethical vigilance in the present, acknowledging that the conditions that enabled its final months, dehumanization, obedience, indifference, and the prioritization of order over life, remain possible wherever systems are allowed to operate without accountability. In this sense, Dachau endures not as a closed chapter of history, but as a mirror held up to humanity, reflecting both the depths of cruelty and the fragile, enduring necessity of remembrance. Chapter 8, Segment 1. From Liberation to Reckoning, Dachau in the Immediate Aftermath. In the days immediately following the liberation of Dachau, the camp existed in a state of fragile suspension between catastrophe and recovery, a place where the machinery of death had stopped moving, but its consequences were still unfolding hour by hour, as thousands of survivors hovered between life and death while Allied forces struggled to comprehend and manage the scale of what they had uncovered. American medical officers quickly realized that liberation itself carried lethal risks, because bodies starved for months could not suddenly absorb normal food, and well-meaning acts of kindness, bread, chocolate, canned meat, sometimes triggered fatal refeeding syndrome, forcing doctors to improvise emergency protocols under conditions of chaos, disease, and overwhelming need. Typhus posed an immediate threat not only to prisoners but to liberators themselves, prompting strict quarantines, delousing operations, and the burning of contaminated clothing and bedding, while entire barracks were evacuated, disinfected, or sealed, transforming the camp into both a humanitarian crisis zone and a biological hazard. Makeshift hospitals were established within the former SS infrastructure, an eerie inversion in which buildings designed for control and punishment were repurposed for care, even as the lack of supplies, trained staff, and sanitation made survival uncertain for many. Death did not end with liberation, and in the weeks that followed, thousands more succumbed to exhaustion, infection, and organ failure, underscoring the reality that Dachau's final months extended beyond the moment Allied troops crossed its gates. At the same time, the Allies faced the task of documenting the camp before evidence could be altered or lost, photographing corpses, recording Baroque conditions, collecting SS records, and securing witness statements, all with the understanding that these materials would be crucial not only for historical truth but for legal accountability. This urgency reflected a growing recognition that Dachau was not an aberration but part of a system, and that proving intent, organization, and responsibility required meticulous preservation of facts. Journalists, military officials, and international observers were brought to the site, some reacting with disbelief, others with rage, their reports spreading images and descriptions that shattered lingering illusions about the nature of the Nazi regime. For many American soldiers, the camp became a defining memory of the war, altering their understanding of what victory meant and what had been at stake, as they confronted the consequences of policies enacted far from the battlefield. Meanwhile, survivors began the painful process of reasserting identity in a world where names had been replaced by numbers, families erased, and homes destroyed, grappling with the realization that liberation did not automatically restore belonging or meaning. Some were too weak to leave, others had nowhere to go, and still others faced hostility or indifference beyond the camp, revealing how displacement and trauma continued long after physical confinement ended. The Allied administration of Dachau reflected these complexities, as the camp was temporarily used to house displaced persons of various nationalities, including former prisoners and forced laborers, creating a liminal space neither prison nor sanctuary, where recovery coexisted with uncertainty. Simultaneously, the pursuit of justice began to take shape as SS personnel captured at or near the camp were detained, interrogated, and prepared for prosecution. Their uniforms and authority stripped away, exposing the banality and fear beneath the symbols of power. The Dachau trials, initiated later in 1945, would focus on crimes committed within the camp system, particularly during its final months when starvation, disease, and executions accelerated, challenging traditional legal frameworks by forcing courts to address responsibility for conditions as well as actions. Prosecutors argued that deliberate neglect, overcrowding, and the continuation of lethal policies despite impending defeat constituted criminal acts, a stance that expanded the understanding of war crimes beyond direct violence to include systemic abuse. These proceedings were closely watched, shaping international legal discourse and contributing to the emerging concept of crimes against humanity, which recognized that the destruction of civilian populations could not be excused as internal policy or wartime necessity. For survivors, the trials offered a measure of acknowledgement, though not closure, as testimony reopened wounds while affirming that their suffering was real and recognized. Yet even as justice was pursued, tensions emerged between the desire to punish perpetrators and the political realities of a world entering the Cold War, where priorities shifted toward reconstruction, stability, and the reintegration of Germany into a new geopolitical order. This shift risked marginalizing the experiences of camps like Dachau, especially those aspects, such as the final months, that revealed how mass death could persist without dramatic spectacle. The immediate aftermath, therefore, became a critical juncture, determining whether Dachau would be remembered as a site of enduring moral significance or gradually absorbed into a narrative of recovery that softened its implications. The presence of the camp itself, with its barbed wire, watchtowers, and silent barracks, resisted such erasure, standing as physical proof that modern states could engineer suffering on an immense scale and maintain it until the very end. In this fragile period, between liberation and normalization, Dachau forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths. That survival was uneven and arbitrary, that liberation could arrive too late, and that the work of understanding and accountability had only just begun. The camp's transformation from a place of terror into a site of testimony was neither immediate nor inevitable, but the result of deliberate choices made in these first weeks and months, choices that shaped how Dachau would be understood not only as a historical location, but as a symbol of the consequences of unchecked power, ideological fanaticism, and human indifference. In this sense, the aftermath of Dachau was not an epilogue to its final months, but an extension of them, a continuation of struggle, in which the fight shifted from physical survival to memory, justice, and the prevention of denial, ensuring that what had happened within its fences could neither be undone nor forgotten. Chapter 8, Segment 2, Memory Under Construction, How Dachau Became Evidence, Warning, and Symbol. As the weeks turned into months after liberation, Dachau entered a new and uneasy phase in which the physical camp remained standing while its meaning was actively contested, shaped, and reconstructed by survivors, occupying authorities, historians, and a world struggling to process what it had uncovered. Because Dachau was not immediately preserved as a memorial but instead existed first as a problem to be managed, a place still filled with suffering bodies, infectious disease, legal questions, and political uncertainty, and only gradually did it become clear that the camp itself had to be protected from erasure just as surely as the testimony of those who had endured it. American authorities initially viewed the site pragmatically, as an emergency zone and later as a facility that could be repurposed, which led to parts of the camp being reused to house displaced persons, former forced laborers, and even German civilians expelled from Eastern Europe, a decision that layered new histories onto old suffering and complicated efforts to define Dachau as a singular space of Nazi crime. This coexistence of survivors and new occupants created tensions, as former prisoners lived alongside individuals who had not shared their experience and, in some cases, had supported or benefited from the regime that imprisoned them, reinforcing the painful truth that liberation did not instantly separate victims from the society that had enabled their persecution. Meanwhile, survivor organizations began to emerge, often informal at first, driven by the urgent need to record names, trace missing relatives, and preserve memories before illness, displacement, or despair silenced them forever. And these early efforts laid the groundwork for what would later become institutional Holocaust remembrance, even though at the time they were acts of personal defiance against forgetting rather than components of an official narrative. Documentation expanded rapidly as military investigators, journalists, and scholars collected photographs, affidavits, camp records, and physical artifacts, recognizing that Dachau's value as evidence extended beyond individual crimes to demonstrate how a concentration camp functioned over time, evolving from a site of political repression into a mechanism of mass death through neglect, exploitation, and terror. This accumulation of evidence confronted the Allies with a moral responsibility to show the German population what had been done in their name, leading to forced visits by local civilians who were compelled to walk through the camp, view the corpses, and witness the conditions, an act intended to shatter denial but which often produced reactions ranging from shock and shame to defensiveness and resentment. These encounters revealed the limits of exposure alone as a tool for moral reckoning, as many civilians struggled to reconcile the reality of Dachau with their own survival strategies under the Nazi state, highlighting how collective responsibility and individual guilt remained deeply contested concepts in the immediate post-war years. At the same time, the Dachau trials brought the camp into the legal realm, transforming survivor suffering into courtroom testimony, where narratives were constrained by evidentiary rules and legal definitions that could never fully capture the lived reality of starvation, fear, and loss, yet still represented a crucial step in establishing that what happened at Dachau was not incidental but criminal, deliberate, and punishable. The trials also exposed the bureaucratic nature of atrocity, as defendants often claimed they were following orders, managing logistics, or maintaining discipline, defenses that forced prosecutors to articulate a new understanding of responsibility within systems designed to diffuse guilt, an understanding that would influence international law for decades to come. As these proceedings unfolded, the physical camp itself became increasingly symbolic, its watchtowers and barbed wire standing not only for Dachau but for the entire network of camps, and debates arose over what should be preserved, demolished, or reconstructed, reflecting deeper questions about how societies remember trauma without normalizing it or turning it into spectacle. Some argued that leaving the camp intact risked freezing it in time, while others feared that dismantling it would enable denial, and these arguments played out amid broader political shifts as Germany was divided, rebuilt, and reintegrated into Europe, processes that sometimes encouraged forgetting in the name of stability. Yet survivors continued to push against silence, insisting that Dachau's story, especially its final months, when death accelerated even as defeat loomed, had to remain visible as proof that genocide does not end neatly with military victory but leaves long shadows that extend into peace. Over time, Dachau began to assume its role as a memorial site, though not without resistance, as Cold War politics, generational distance, and competing narratives of German victimhood complicated efforts to center the experiences of camp prisoners. Nonetheless, the camp's existence as a preserved space of terror challenged revisionism by offering tangible evidence that ideology, bureaucracy, and obedience could combine to produce mass death without the dramatic machinery of extermination centers, making Dachau a crucial reference point in understanding how modern societies can normalize cruelty. The transformation of Dachau from camp to memorial was therefore not a single decision but a gradual process shaped by activism, scholarship, and moral insistence, one that required confronting uncomfortable truths about collaboration, indifference, and the fragility of ethical boundaries under authoritarian rule. As educational programs developed and visitors began arriving not as investigators or survivors, but as students and citizens, Dachau's meaning expanded further, becoming a place where history demanded engagement rather than passive consumption, forcing each generation to ask how such a system could arise and what safeguards are necessary to prevent its return. In this way, The post-liberation life of Dachau revealed that memory itself is a battleground, contested by forces of denial, fatigue, and politicization, and that preserving the truth of the camp's final months, when starvation, disease, and chaos claimed lives, even as freedom approached, was essential to understanding the full scope of Nazi terror. Dachau's endurance as a symbol was not guaranteed by its fences or buildings, but by the continued effort to interpret, teach, and remember, ensuring that the camp remained not a relic of the past but a warning embedded in the present, reminding the world that systems of oppression rarely announce their end and that vigilance, like memory, must be actively maintained to retain its power. Chapter 8, Segment 3. From Crime Scene to Conscience, Dachau's Place in Global Memory. By the time Dachau's transformation into a permanent memorial began to solidify, the camp had already become something larger than its fences and foundations, evolving from a site of immediate post-war crisis into a global symbol through which the world would attempt to understand not only Nazi crimes but the broader mechanics of state-sponsored terror, because Dachau was never just about the men who died there or the SS who ran it, but about how modern societies organize power, obedience, and exclusion, lessons that extended far beyond Germany's borders and decades beyond 1945. As the Cold War reshaped political priorities, remembrance often competed with convenience, and there were moments when the preservation of Dachau seemed uncertain, threatened by redevelopment plans, bureaucratic inertia, or the desire to move forward without confronting the past too directly. Yet each attempt to minimize or obscure the camp's history was met with resistance from survivors and their descendants, who understood that forgetting was not neutral but dangerous, a continuation of the same logic that had once rendered their suffering invisible. Survivor testimony became the backbone of Dachau's moral authority, as men who had once been reduced to numbers stood before audiences to describe hunger that hollowed bodies and spirits, beatings administered as routine discipline, and the final months when death accelerated through neglect rather than gas, making clear that extermination could occur through systems designed to look administratively ordinary. These voices, fragile yet insistent, challenged the tendency to treat the Holocaust as an abstract catastrophe, anchoring it instead in specific places, policies, and decisions, and Dachau's role as the first Nazi concentration camp gave these testimonies particular weight, demonstrating how a model of repression, once normalized, could be expanded, refined, and ultimately lethal. Educational initiatives gradually transformed the camp into a space of learning rather than passive observation, emphasizing not only what happened but how it happened, tracing the progression from political imprisonment to forced labor to mass death, and underscoring the continuity between early abuses and later atrocities, a continuity that dismantled myths of sudden radicalization by showing how violence grows incrementally when unchallenged. International visitors brought their own histories and anxieties to Dachau, interpreting its lessons through the lens of other genocides, dictatorships, and systems of oppression, which reinforced the camp's relevance as a universal warning rather than a closed chapter of German history. At the same time, debates over representation persisted, particularly around how to convey suffering without sensationalism and how to balance factual documentation with ethical restraint, concerns that shaped museum design, exhibit language, and guided tours, reflecting and evolving understanding of trauma and respect for victims. Dachau also became a reference point in legal and philosophical discussions about human rights, contributing to post-war frameworks that sought to define crimes against humanity and establish norms that transcended national sovereignty, an outcome that contrasted sharply with the camp's origins as a tool of state power unbound by moral accountability. Yet these achievements did not erase discomfort, as the presence of tourists, cameras, and quiet pathways through former killing grounds raised persistent questions about consumption versus commemoration, questions that Dachau's custodians addressed by emphasizing reflection, context, and responsibility over spectacle. The camp's continued existence forced Germany to confront its past repeatedly, particularly as new generations asked why such crimes occurred and what ordinary people did, or failed to do, while they unfolded, making Dachau a site where national identity was renegotiated, through acknowledgement rather than denial. Crucially, the memory of Dachau's final months, when chaos replaced order and death came through abandonment as much as brutality, complicated simplified narratives of liberation by revealing that the end of Nazi rule did not immediately end suffering, a reality that challenged triumphant accounts of victory and emphasized the human cost that lingered after flags were lowered and guns fell silent. This insistence on complexity ensured that Dachau remained relevant not as a frozen monument but as an active moral question, asking each visitor how societies slip from legality into atrocity and how easily institutions can be repurposed to destroy rather than protect. In the decades since liberation, Dachau's story has been woven into global Holocaust education, shaping curricula, influencing memorial practices, and informing discussions about genocide prevention, yet its power lies less in its prominence than in its specificity, in the concrete details of barracks, roll calls, and disease that resist abstraction. As denialism and distortion emerged in various forms, Dachau stood as a rebuttal grounded in evidence, testimony, and preserved space, reminding the world that history is not merely a collection of narratives but a record of material realities that can be visited, studied, and verified. Ultimately, Dachau's journey from concentration camp to memorial illustrates that remembrance is not automatic but constructed. Through sustained effort, ethical commitment, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, and that the camp's endurance as a symbol depends on continued engagement rather than reverence alone. By holding the memory of Dachau's final months alongside its origins and aftermath, the world is compelled to see the Holocaust not as a single moment of horror but as a process enabled by choices, structures, and silences, a process whose lessons remain urgent wherever power operates without accountability, making Dachau not only a testament to suffering endured but a perpetual warning about what can happen when humanity is reduced to policy and conscience is surrendered to command. Chapter 9, Segment 1. Judgment after the gates, the Dachau trials, and the search for accountability. When the gates of Dachau closed behind the last surviving prisoners and the dead were finally buried, the world faced a question that no liberation photograph could answer. What would justice look like after crimes of this scale, committed not in secret by a few renegades, but openly by an entire system that had normalized cruelty as policy? The immediate aftermath of Dachau's liberation was chaos, marked by emergency medical response, typhus containment, and the shock of discovery, but almost as quickly, American authorities recognized that the camp itself was a crime scene, and that without swift legal action, evidence would be lost, perpetrators would disappear, and the narrative of what had occurred could be rewritten by denial or minimization. Dachau, therefore, became one of the first sites where Allied forces attempted to transform moral outrage into judicial process, laying the groundwork for what would become the Dachau trials, a series of U.S. military tribunals held between 1945 and 1948 that prosecuted SS personnel, camp officials, guards, and collaborators connected not only to Dachau itself but to its vast network of subcamps. Unlike later international proceedings such as Nuremberg, these trials were conducted under military law, emphasizing speed and practicality over philosophical breadth. Yet their significance was profound because they confronted a reality that conventional legal systems had never been designed to address: crimes committed through bureaucracy, obedience, and routine rather than singular acts of passion. Prosecutors faced the challenge of proving guilt in an environment where murder had been administrative, where responsibility was fragmented across roles, and where defendants often claimed they were merely following orders, a defense that had rarely been tested at this scale. Survivor testimony became central, not only recounting specific acts of brutality but demonstrating patterns of behavior that established systemic cruelty, showing that Dachau was not a place where abuses occurred sporadically, but one where violence was embedded into daily operation. From roll calls that lasted hours in freezing conditions to punishments designed to humiliate and destroy rather than correct. Documents recovered from the camp, including records of executions, transfers, and labor assignments, provided corroboration, grounding personal accounts in bureaucratic evidence that revealed how thoroughly violence had been organized. The trials also exposed the diversity of perpetrators, challenging simplistic images of monstrous villains by revealing clerks, doctors, and mid-level administrators whose decisions directly contributed to suffering and death, underscoring that genocide does not require universal sadism but rather widespread compliance. Sentences ranged from imprisonment to death, reflecting both the gravity of crimes and the evolving legal standards of the time. Yet even as verdicts were handed down, controversy followed, with critics arguing that military tribunals lacked due process and supporters insisting that extraordinary crimes demanded extraordinary measures. These debates highlighted a deeper tension between retribution and rule of law, a tension that would shape post-war justice efforts globally. Importantly, the Dachau trials established precedents that extended beyond punishment, affirming that individuals could be held accountable for crimes against humanity regardless of rank or national law, a principle that challenged centuries-old assumptions about sovereignty and obedience. For survivors, the trials were both necessary and insufficient, offering recognition and condemnation but unable to restore what had been lost or fully articulate the depth of suffering endured, a gap that many described as an enduring wound. Nonetheless, the act of naming crimes and perpetrators mattered, countering the Nazi attempt to erase evidence through death marches and destruction, and transforming Dachau from a site of silenced suffering into one of documented truth. The trials also influenced public understanding of the Holocaust, particularly in the United States, where media coverage introduced audiences to the realities of concentration camps through courtroom testimony rather than battlefield reports, shaping early narratives of Nazi criminality. Over time, as Cold War politics shifted priorities, and West Germany sought reintegration into the international community, the momentum of prosecutions slowed, leaving many perpetrators untried and raising difficult questions about selective justice and political expediency. Yet the existence of the Dachau trials ensured that accountability was not entirely abandoned, providing a foundation upon which later generations could build renewed efforts to confront the past. The legacy of these trials lies not only in their verdicts but in their assertion that law could, however imperfectly, respond to mass atrocity, and that the transition from liberation to justice was itself a crucial stage in dismantling the system that Dachau represented. By placing perpetrators before judges rather than firing squads, the Allies signaled that the response to systematic dehumanization would not be indiscriminate vengeance but an attempt, however flawed, to reaffirm the principle that human actions remain subject to moral and legal scrutiny even in the aftermath of unimaginable violence, making the Dachau trials a pivotal moment where the world began, haltingly, to reckon with the meaning of justice after genocide. Chapter 9, Segment 2, Memory Under Pressure, Silence, Denial, and the Struggle to Preserve Dachau's Truth. In the years following the Dachau trials, a quieter but equally consequential battle unfolded beyond courtrooms and barbed wire, as the memory of the camp entered a contested space shaped by political necessity, social fatigue, and the human desire to move on from catastrophe, and this struggle over remembrance would determine whether Dachau remained a warning or faded into abstraction. Immediately after liberation, the camp stood as undeniable evidence of Nazi crimes, its barracks, crematoria, and mass graves photographed, catalogued, and studied by Allied investigators. Yet as Germany lay in ruins and the Cold War hardened into a defining global conflict, priorities shifted, transforming former enemies into strategic partners and recasting uncomfortable truths as obstacles to reconstruction. Within West Germany, many citizens sought distance from the past, framing Dachau as an aberration imposed by a small criminal elite rather than a system sustained by widespread participation or acquiescence, a narrative that allowed millions to reclaim normalcy without confronting complicity. Survivors, meanwhile, faced a different reality, struggling to rebuild lives in societies that often preferred silence to testimony, where recounting camp experiences could be met with disbelief, discomfort, or indifference, compounding trauma with isolation. The physical site of Dachau mirrored this ambivalence, repurposed initially to house displaced persons and later used by German authorities. For various functions, its identity as a place of suffering threatened by practical concerns and political reluctance to preserve a symbol of national shame. Debates erupted over whether the camp should be demolished, transformed, or memorialized, revealing deep divisions about how the past should inhabit the present. Survivor organizations and international advocates fought to protect Dachau from erasure, arguing that forgetting would complete the Nazi objective of annihilation not only of bodies but of memory itself, and through petitions, public pressure, and persistent engagement with authorities, they slowly forced recognition that remembrance was not a burden but a responsibility. This effort culminated in the establishment of the Dachau Concentration Camp memorial site in 1965, 2 decades after liberation, a delay that spoke volumes about the difficulty of institutionalizing memory in a society eager for renewal. Even then, the memorial's initial scope was limited, reflecting compromises between survivors' demands for truth and official concerns about political stability. Yet its existence marked a turning point, anchoring Dachau in public consciousness as a site of education rather than denial. The struggle did not end with the opening of the memorial, as denial and distortion persisted, ranging from outright Holocaust denial to subtler forms of minimization that reframed suffering as collateral damage of war rather than the product of deliberate policy. Educators and historians responded by expanding research, integrating survivor testimony with archival documentation to counter false narratives, transforming Dachau into a focal point for understanding the mechanics of repression and the human cost of ideology. Generational change also played a role, as younger Germans began questioning inherited silences, demanding fuller accounts of what had occurred and how ordinary institutions had been implicated, shifting memory from a source of guilt to a tool for critical reflection. Internationally, Dachau became a symbol invoked in discussions of human rights, genocide prevention, and the ethics of obedience, its history used to illustrate how quickly legal norms can collapse when authority is unchecked and dehumanization normalized. Yet the process of remembrance remained fragile, vulnerable to political polarization and the passage of time, which threatened to reduce lived experience to distant history. Survivor voices, once central, gradually diminished as age claimed witnesses, increasing the urgency of preserving testimony through recordings, museums, and curricula capable of transmitting memory without direct presence. This transition raised profound questions about how societies remember atrocities once those who endured them are gone, and whether empathy can survive without personal encounter. Dachau's preservation thus became more than an act of commemoration, serving as a laboratory for memory itself, demonstrating that remembrance requires active maintenance rather than passive acknowledgement. By confronting visitors with physical spaces and documented narratives, the memorial resists abstraction, insisting that the camp's horrors were real, specific, and human-made. The tension between forgetting and remembering continues to shape Dachau's legacy, reminding the world that the end of killing does not mark the end of responsibility, and that the preservation of truth is an ongoing act of resistance against the forces of denial and indifference that allow history's darkest chapters to be repeated under new names and circumstances. Chapter 9, Segment 3, From Evidence to Warning, Dachau's Place in Global Memory. As the decades passed and the physical wounds of war faded from Europe's landscape, Dachau gradually transformed from a crime scene into a moral reference point, a place where the past was no longer only examined for what it revealed about Nazi Germany, but for what it warned about humanity itself. Historians increasingly understood that Dachau was not exceptional because it was uniquely cruel, but because it was frighteningly ordinary in its structure, a system built step by step through laws, bureaucracy, discipline, and obedience, long before mass murder reached its peak, making the camp a case study in how modern states can normalize repression without immediate resistance. This realization elevated Dachau's significance beyond German history, positioning it within a global conversation about authoritarianism, human rights, and the fragility of democratic norms, as scholars, educators, and policymakers began drawing parallels between the mechanisms of control perfected there and those appearing in other contexts around the world. School groups, diplomats, and international delegations walked the grounds not only to learn what happened between 1933 and 1945, but to ask how similar patterns could emerge again under different flags, languages, and justifications. The camp's barracks, preserved and reconstructed, became classrooms without walls, teaching lessons about conformity, fear, and moral compromise that transcended national borders. Survivor testimonies, once fragile and easily dismissed, were now recognized as irreplaceable historical sources. Their voices integrated into archives, museums, and digital collections to ensure that personal memory could survive biological limits. Dachau's documentation efforts expanded, combining forensic evidence with human stories to counter denial and distortion, reinforcing the idea that truth must be actively defended against erosion by time and ideology. Yet even as recognition grew, challenges persisted, as political extremism resurfaced in various parts of the world, often accompanied by attempts to relativize or weaponize history, reducing camps like Dachau to symbols used selectively rather than warnings understood fully. Debates erupted over language, comparisons, and responsibility, underscoring that memory is not static but contested, shaped by present fears and ambitions as much as by past facts. Within Germany, Dachau played a central role in the country's ongoing reckoning with its history, serving as a touchstone for public discussions about guilt, accountability, and the limits of forgiveness, reminding citizens that acknowledging past crimes is not an act of self-destruction but a foundation for ethical identity. Internationally, the camp became part of a broader memorial network linking sites of atrocity across continents, reinforcing the understanding that genocide is not a uniquely German phenomenon but a recurring human failure enabled by similar conditions. Wherever they arise, educators emphasize Dachau's early role in the Nazi system to demonstrate that mass murder does not begin with killing, but with exclusion, dehumanization, and the gradual suspension of empathy, lessons increasingly relevant in a world facing polarization, misinformation, and rising intolerance. The memorial's evolution reflected this shift, expanding exhibitions to address not only camp history but the psychology of perpetrators, the choices of bystanders, and the resilience of victims, reframing Dachau as a mirror rather than a relic. Visitors were encouraged not only to mourn the dead, but to examine their own responsibilities within contemporary societies, confronting uncomfortable questions about obedience, silence, and moral courage. As survivor generations passed, the responsibility of remembrance transferred fully to institutions and individuals who never experienced the camps firsthand, heightening the risk of abstraction but also broadening the scope of reflection. Dachau's continued preservation thus became an act of vigilance, asserting that memory is not an inheritance guaranteed by time, but a practice requiring renewal, honesty, and moral engagement. The camp's legacy ultimately lies not only in what happened within its fences, but in what the world chooses to do with that knowledge, whether it remains a static memorial to past suffering or an active warning against future crimes. By standing as both evidence and lesson, Dachau challenges each generation to recognize how quickly civilized structures can be repurposed for destruction, and how easily indifference can become complicity, making its story not just a chapter of history, but a continuous test of humanity's capacity to learn, resist, and remember. Chapter 10, Segment 1. The Long Shadow After Liberation, Dachau and the World That Inherited It. In the years following the liberation of Dachau, the camp's existence refused to recede quietly into the past, instead casting a long and unsettling shadow over the post-war world, as nations struggled to understand how such a system had not only been created but maintained for more than a decade within a society that had once considered itself modern, cultured, and lawful. Dachau became a central reference point in the early Cold War era, when the language of never again clashed with new geopolitical anxieties, forcing governments to reconcile moral lessons with strategic interests, even as former perpetrators reintegrated into civilian life and victims attempted to rebuild lives fractured beyond repair. The immediate post-war years saw a complex and often contradictory response to the camp's legacy, with public horror coexisting alongside fatigue, denial, and a desire to move forward without fully confronting the implications of what had been revealed, leading to uneven justice and selective memory. For many Germans, Dachau represented both a symbol of shame and a source of defensive resentment. As the process of denazification stalled and former SS members quietly resumed ordinary lives, their crimes diluted by time, bureaucracy, and political necessity. Internationally, Dachau's story entered textbooks, courtrooms, and diplomatic discourse, influencing the drafting of human rights conventions and the legal definition of crimes against humanity. Yet these developments often unfolded abstractly, far removed from the physical reality of starvation, disease, and terror that had defined daily life in the camp. Survivors, carrying trauma that language could scarcely contain, found themselves caught between a world eager for testimony and one uncomfortable with sustained listening, their experiences alternately elevated as moral authority and marginalized as inconvenient reminders. The camp itself, now a memorial, became a contested space where grief, education, tourism, and politics intersected, raising questions about how societies should commemorate atrocity without trivializing it, and how to teach horror without numbing those who encounter it. As decades passed, Dachau's relevance expanded beyond Holocaust history alone, increasingly cited in discussions about authoritarianism, mass detention, and the abuse of state power, its early role as a model camp, underscoring how systems of repression rarely emerge fully formed but grow incrementally through legal normalization and social acquiescence. Scholars emphasize that Dachau's victims were not only Jews but political opponents, clergy, Roma, homosexuals, and others deemed undesirable, complicating simplistic narratives and reinforcing the camp's function as a laboratory of terror whose methods could be adapted to different targets over time. This broader understanding challenged audiences to recognize patterns rather than isolate events, making Dachau less a singular horror and more a warning about the mechanisms through which violence becomes institutionalized. The camp's documentation, preserved through photographs, records, and testimony, continued to shape historical methodology, demonstrating the necessity of interdisciplinary approaches that combined forensic evidence with personal narratives to counter denial and distortion. Yet memory remained fragile, threatened by the passing of witnesses and the rise of misinformation, requiring renewed commitment from educators, archivists, and institutions to sustain accuracy and relevance. Dachau's post-war story thus unfolded not as a clean arc toward enlightenment, but as an ongoing struggle between remembrance and forgetting, accountability and convenience, truth and simplification. In this tension lay the camp's enduring significance, as a place that refused to be fully contained by history, persistently asking whether the lessons drawn from its existence would be applied meaningfully or reduced to ritualized slogans. As the world entered new eras marked by surveillance technologies, mass displacement, and polarized politics, Dachau's example gained renewed urgency, reminding observers that the conditions enabling atrocity often present themselves gradually, wrapped in the language of security, efficiency, and order. The camp's legacy, therefore, was not confined to the crimes committed within its fences, but extended into the moral choices faced by every subsequent generation, challenging them to recognize early warning signs, defend human dignity, and resist the normalization of cruelty long before it acquires a name, a uniform, or a gate. Chapter 10, Segment 2, Justice, Memory, and the Uneasy Inheritance of Dachau. As the decades unfolded after Dachau's liberation, the question of justice became as complex and contested as the memory of the camp itself, revealing how difficult it was for societies to translate moral outrage into sustained accountability once the immediacy of war faded. The Dachau trials, conducted by U.S. military tribunals between 1945 and 1948, initially appeared to signal a firm commitment to reckoning, as camp personnel, SS guards, doctors, and administrators were prosecuted for war crimes under newly articulated legal frameworks, their actions examined not as isolated excesses but as part of an organized system of abuse. Yet even these proceedings reflected the limits of post-war justice, shaped by evidentiary challenges, political pressures, and the emerging priorities of a divided Europe. While many perpetrators received sentences ranging from imprisonment to execution, thousands more slipped through the cracks, their roles minimized or overlooked as Cold War tensions redirected attention toward rebuilding West Germany as a strategic ally, allowing former Nazis to re-enter public life with remarkable speed. This uneven accountability deeply affected survivors, who often watched their tormentors resume ordinary lives while they themselves struggled with trauma, displacement, and loss, reinforcing a sense that justice had been partial at best and profoundly insufficient at worst. Memory, meanwhile, became a battleground of its own, as Dachau's transformation into a memorial site forced difficult decisions about representation, responsibility, and narrative control, with early post-war commemorations emphasizing political prisoners and resistance fighters while marginalizing Jewish suffering, reflecting broader national discomfort with confronting the full scope of anti-Semitic genocide. Only gradually, through survivor advocacy and historical scholarship, did the memorial's interpretation expand to acknowledge the camp's diverse victim groups and its central role within the Nazi system of repression, illustrating how remembrance is not static but evolves through struggle and debate. Education emerged as a critical yet imperfect tool in this process, with Dachau incorporated into curricula and public discourse as a cautionary example, even as generational distance risked transforming lived horror into abstract lesson, prompting ongoing efforts to connect historical analysis with ethical reflection. The preservation of original structures, artifacts, and documentation served not only as evidence against denial but also as a means of confronting visitors with the physical reality of the camp, challenging sanitized narratives that might otherwise dull its impact. Still, controversies persisted over how much to reconstruct, how much to leave in ruin, and how to balance accessibility with reverence, underscoring the inherent tension between memorialization and the passage of time. Internationally, Dachau influenced the development of human rights law and the concept of universal moral responsibility. Its legacy echoed in conventions against genocide, torture, and arbitrary detention. Yet these legal instruments often struggled to prevent new atrocities, revealing a gap between remembrance and action. The camp's name became shorthand for absolute moral failure, invoked in debates about political imprisonment and state violence, sometimes thoughtfully, sometimes carelessly, raising questions about the ethical use of historical analogies. For Germany, Dachau remained a mirror reflecting both progress and unresolved issues, as public acknowledgement of guilt coexisted with periodic resurgences of denial, relativization, and extremist rhetoric, reminding observers that historical awareness requires constant reinforcement. Survivors' testimonies, recorded in interviews, memoirs, and courtroom statements, became increasingly vital as living bridges to the past, their voices carrying authority precisely because they resisted abstraction, insisting on the individuality of suffering against the anonymity imposed by mass crime. As these witnesses aged, institutions raced to preserve their words, recognizing that memory without storytellers risks becoming hollow, vulnerable to distortion or indifference. Dachau's post-war narrative thus unfolded as an ongoing negotiation between justice and compromise, memory and forgetting, education and complacency, revealing that the true measure of liberation was not merely the opening of gates but the willingness of societies to confront uncomfortable truths long after the last soldiers had left. In this sense, Dachau did not end in 1945, but continued to exist as a moral challenge, asking each generation whether it would treat the camp as a closed chapter safely contained in history, or as an enduring warning demanding vigilance, empathy, and the courage to oppose systems that dehumanize long before they become lethal. Chapter 10, Segment 3, Dachau's final lesson: How atrocity becomes possible, and why memory alone is not enough. In the long shadow cast by Dachau, the final lesson it offers is not contained solely in its barbed wire, crematoria, or liberation photographs, but in the unsettling realization of how ordinary structures of society, law, medicine, administration, obedience, and silence, were slowly reshaped into tools of mass atrocity, a process that did not require sudden madness or universal cruelty, but rather a gradual erosion of moral boundaries that many people accepted step by step. Dachau began not as a death camp but as a protective custody site for political opponents, framed through legal language that reassured the public while normalizing the idea that certain people could be removed from society without trial, a concept that metastasized over time as categories expanded, protections vanished, and cruelty became routine. The camp's history demonstrates how violence does not always arrive as a dramatic rupture but often emerges through bureaucratic refinement, where paperwork replaces conscience and efficiency becomes an excuse for inhumanity, allowing perpetrators to view themselves as functionaries rather than moral agents. This transformation was enabled by widespread compliance. Guards who followed orders, civilians who benefited from confiscated labor, professionals who rationalized participation, and neighbors who chose not to look too closely, illustrating that atrocity systems rely not only on fanatics but on vast networks of passive cooperation. Dachau's endurance. Across 12 years of Nazi rule further reveals how institutions designed for repression tend to escalate once established, as normalization dulls outrage and extreme measures become simply how things are done. A pattern visible in the camp's shift from political detention to racial persecution, forced labor, medical experimentation, and mass death through neglect and disease. The final months of Dachau exposed the ultimate consequence of this process, when the system collapsed inward, no longer even pretending to serve ideological or economic purpose, yet continuing to kill through inertia alone, demonstrating how systems of cruelty, once unleashed, do not stop themselves even when their creators know they are doomed. Liberation, though essential, did not erase the damage, as survivors carried lifelong physical and psychological wounds, while societies faced the burden of rebuilding amid unresolved guilt and selective remembrance, proving that the end of violence does not mark the end of its consequences. Dachau's post-war legacy underscores a critical truth. Remembrance without responsibility risks becoming ritual rather than warning, especially when memorialization is detached from contemporary ethical reflection. The camp challenges future generations not simply to mourn victims, but to examine the early warning signs within their own societies: language that dehumanizes, laws that strip rights incrementally, institutions that prioritize order over justice, and narratives that frame exclusion as necessity. Education about Dachau is therefore not merely historical instruction but a form of civic defense, equipping individuals to recognize how quickly fear and ideology can be weaponized when democratic safeguards erode. The camp's preservation stands as an indictment not only of Nazism but of the universal human capacity to adapt to injustice when it becomes normalized, reminding us that never again is not a passive vow but an active obligation, requiring constant vigilance, empathy, and resistance to moral complacency. Dachau's final lesson is uncomfortable because it refuses to allow distance. Its perpetrators were not monsters from another world, but people embedded in families, careers, and routines, which forces an unsettling question upon the present. If such a system could arise once, through gradual choices and widespread acquiescence, what prevents it from happening again under different names and circumstances? In confronting this question honestly, Dachau ceases to be only a site of past suffering and becomes a mirror held up to the present, asking whether memory will serve as a shield against repetition or fade into abstraction as time moves on. The true legacy of Dachau, then, is not confined to history books or memorial grounds, but lives on as a moral test passed from one generation to the next, a reminder that the conditions enabling mass atrocity begin long before camps are built, and that preventing future horrors depends not on hindsight, but on the courage to act when injustice is still incremental, unpopular to oppose, and easy to ignore. Remembering Dachau, guarding the future as this documentary comes to an end, the gates of Dachau close once more, not to seal away the past, but to hold it in view. What happened here was not an accident of history, nor the work of a single madman or a handful of villains. Dachau was a system, carefully constructed, patiently expanded, and sustained by obedience, silence, and the slow normalization of cruelty. Its final months revealed the inevitable outcome of such a system. When humanity is stripped away piece by piece, death becomes routine, and collapse brings only more suffering. To remember Dachau is not only to honor the victims who endured starvation, disease, terror, and loss beyond measure. It is to listen to the warning they left behind. The conditions that made Dachau possible did not begin with barbed wire or watchtowers. They began with words, laws, exclusions, and choices that seemed small at the time. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it often follows familiar paths. This story is preserved so it cannot be denied, distorted, or forgotten. Memory is not passive. It demands responsibility. It asks us to recognize early signs of dehumanization, to question authority when it demands cruelty, and to protect the dignity of others even when it is inconvenient or dangerous to do so. May the voices of Dachau's victims remain louder than the silence that once surrounded them. May remembrance become vigilance. And may the lessons learned here guide future generations away from the road that led to these gates. Because remembering Dachau is not about the past alone. It is about the world we choose to build next.